Chapter 1. Josephine McClain sat perched on the edge of the sofa in the parlor of the only home she'd ever known. She smiled timidly at her father and the woman he'd been courting for the past several months. Her mother had died 5 years before, and she had kept her father's house ever since. "Is everything all right?" she asked, looking back and forth between them. Her father looked down at his hands, and Mrs. Melton answered for them both. "Everything is fine. We just wanted you to know that we'll be getting married in 2 weeks' time. When that happens, I will of course take over the managing of the household, and you will no longer be needed." Josie blinked twice, staring at the woman. She'd never been terribly fond of her, but this was cold even by her standards. "Where am I supposed to go?" She was half surprised Mrs. Melton didn't want her to stay on as a servant. That was just the type of woman she was. Sadly, Josie was sure she'd agree. "Go? Why would that matter to us?" Mrs. Melton said with a sickly smile. "I do know that my brother and his wife are in need of a nanny for their children." Josie closed her eyes for a moment. She happened to know that the Meltons had 10 children and no respect for the time of their hired help. She also knew that Mr. Melton had more than once been accused of forcing unwanted attentions onto the nannies his wife hired. "I see. Would you like me to introduce you to my sister-in-law?" Mrs. Melton asked, her hand on Josie's father's shoulder possessively. "No, thank you. I will look around and see what I can find. Thank you for giving me 2 weeks' notice." Josie knew it wasn't nearly enough time for her to find a place to go, but she couldn't let it matter. She wouldn't let the older woman see that she was bothered by it all. Her father looked up then, his eyes meeting Josie's. "I will help you as much as I can. You've done so much more than I imagined you could do all these years. I've been comfortable, if not happy, without your mother." "Thank you, Papa." His words meant nothing if he was going to marry that witch, though. Mrs. Melton would see to it her father would never again see her. Josie got to her feet. "I'm going to go for a walk now. Maybe Mrs. Melton will see to your supper while I see to my future." She held her head high as she left the house, not allowing the tears to fall until she was a block away, walking as fast as she could. She wasn't watching where she was going and ran into a rather rotund older woman with gray hair and laughing blue eyes. "Are you all right?" the grandmotherly woman asked her. "Yes, no, I'm not fine. I'm not fine at all. In 2 weeks, I will no longer have a place to live because my father is making the biggest mistake of his life, but I don't dare tell him so because she wants me to work for her brother, who will try to lure me into the servant's closet, and I'm not going in there with him." Josie looked at the woman in front of her defiantly. She was tired of always acting as if everything was all right when it wasn't. It wasn't all right at all. The woman patted her arm. "Let's see if I can help you. Are you going somewhere in particular?" "Why would I be going somewhere in particular? Didn't I just finish telling you I have no place to go? My house is just around this corner." The woman put her arm around Josie and started steering her in a completely different direction. "My name is Hazel Hughes, but most people just call me Miss Hazel." Josie had heard tell of a woman called Miss Hazel who was helping women in town. She couldn't remember the details, and she'd certainly never thought she would be one of Miss Hazel's charity cases, but what choice did she have? Mrs. Melton was moving in, and that meant she was moving out. When they reached the nice home, right there in the same neighborhood where Josie lived with her father, Miss Hazel opened the door. "I'm going to leave you in the parlor for a moment while I prepare some tea." "You do like tea, don't you?" "I'm not sure it's legal to live in Canada and not enjoy tea," Josie returned, swiping at the tears on her face. She never cried, and she especially never cried in public or in front of strangers. What a day this was turning out to be. As she sat and waited, she looked around the room where she was sitting. There was a man in a Mountie uniform beside a beautiful young woman who looked vaguely familiar to Josie. And that's when she remembered. This Miss Hazel was a matchmaker to the Mounties. She was always looking for new women to marry off to different Mounties. As soon as that thought occurred to her, she had to wonder if she really wanted to be the wife of a Mountie. Sure, they were brave, strong, and served their country, but they were also away a great deal. Not that she would mind a husband who was away, especially if she didn't know him. It must be uncomfortable to be alone with a man you barely know. When Miss Hazel returned with the tea and cookies, Josie gave her a curious look. "Do you want me to marry a Mountie?" Miss Hazel grinned, her entire face lighting up with excitement at the question. "Is my reputation preceding me?" "It is. Jess Sanderson was a teller at the bank, and I went often to run errands for my father." They were all talking about her going west to marry a Mountie. Miss Hazel smiled as she took a chair perpendicular to the sofa where Josie was sitting. "Jess went west and married my Mountie. That's my son Theodore. Jess is expecting." She looked so proud when she spoke of Jess, Theodore, and the baby. Josie smiled. "So you think you're going to send me west to marry a Mountie, too? That is what this is all about, isn't it?" Miss Hazel shook her head. "Believe it or not, I want to send you east to marry a Mountie. To Prince Edward Island." She reached to a pile of papers beside her, and she pulled one of them from the stack. "This is from a Mountie named Ernest that I think will suit you beautifully." Josie found herself intrigued against her will. She'd never even thought to marry a law enforcement officer, but the idea of marrying someone now and having a place to go that would be safe, how could she not be intrigued by the idea? "Dear potential bride, my brother, Bert, was recently matched up with a bride who has made him and his daughters extremely happy. As a Mountie, I find it hard to find the time to court a woman. I find I'm very interested in meeting a bride of my own, but I'd rather she just be sent to me as Bert's bride was sent to him. I'd like a woman who can take care of a home and enjoys cooking. Someone who enjoys dancing might be nice as well, but that part isn't necessary. I find that I want to be able to talk to someone at the end of my day. If you are a young woman between the ages of 19 and 25 and you are lonely, too, I hope I will hear from you. I'm stationed on Prince Edward Island, so if you have always dreamed of moving to the west, I may not be the Mountie for you. Sincerely, Ernie." Josie read the letter once more, thinking about the man who had written that letter and was sitting at home, lonely, waiting for a response. She looked up, her eyes meeting Miss Hazel's. "Yes." "When?" Miss Hazel smiled. "I like a decisive young woman. I start a new group of brides here on Monday. I will teach you how to keep house and cook. I don't like to send a bride unless I know she's ready for the tasks in front of her. Her father wouldn't be marrying until the week after, but it wouldn't hurt him if she left a week early." A tiny vindictive part of her wanted to see Mrs. Melton deal with keeping house a week earlier than she had planned. "Sounds good. All right. I'll need you to move in on Monday morning. I expect the ladies here by 8. Does that work for you? You'll have your own room here, and I'll see that you get to your destination safely." Josie tilted her head to one side. "Do you travel with us?" "Well, of course. How else am I going to get to see Canada at my age? I'm excited to learn anything you want to teach me." Josie reached for a cup of tea and a cookie. "I'm so glad I ran into you on the street this morning." "Me too." Miss Hazel grinned at her. Ernest walked into the Mountie office first thing on Monday morning, wanting to talk to his commanding officer. He was certain something more than they realized was going on. Stepping into the office, he found Timothy, a man he truly respected, face down on his desk in a pool of blood. Rushing to his side, he picked up the man's cold hand and checked his wrist for a pulse. Nothing. He was dead. Ernie backed out of the office, running down the street to his Mountie friends' homes. They would have to investigate, figure out who was missing, and go from there. It was too late to send a telegram to Miss Hazel. She'd be leaving with the brides any minute. Hopefully they could have a replacement in a few days. He shook his head. Timothy had been a good man, and he was too young to die. Too good to die that way. Who would have done such a thing? Sitting on the train beside Elizabeth, one of the other brides, Josie pointed out the window. "I think we're almost to the ferry. Have you ever been on a ferry?" Josie loved the entire trip out to the dock. Every minute of this entire journey to marry a stranger had her filled with joy. She knew it was crazy, but thwarting Mrs. Melton even a little bit made her a great deal happier than it should have. When they got to the dock, Elizabeth looked worried. She was wringing her hands again, and Josie gave her a quick hug. "We're going to love PEI. We're going to be so happy with our new husbands. Mounties." There was a Mountie sitting next to one of the other brides, who was named Nettie. Nettie seemed off to Josie, but she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way she asked the others so many personal questions, but never answered any that were asked of her. There was just something not quite right about her, but Josie didn't care. As long as she stuck to her own Mountie and left Ernie alone, all would be well. "You aren't nervous at all, are you?" Elizabeth asked, a look of surprise on her face. "I'm really not," Josie responded. "I'm ready for whatever life throws at me, and I'm going to embrace it all. Ernie wants to marry me, and I know I can make his life better. Why worry? I wish I was as confident as you are. I spent a lot of years doing chores that were meant for someone much older. I've been my father's hostess for 5 years now. Miss Hazel didn't teach us to do anything I didn't already know how to do." Josie shrugged. "If you have any trouble, you know I'm here for you. When you've gone through housekeeping classes with someone, you're required to be friends for life." Elizabeth smiled, some of the worry disappearing from her face. "Oh? Did you read this law somewhere?" "I didn't need to. I make my own laws," Josie said with a wink. Elizabeth laughed then, a full belly laugh. "I think my favorite thing about you is you always lift my spirits. That's what lifelong housekeeping class friends do. They lift each other's spirits." Josie turned and saw the ferry coming toward them. "Oh, look. There's the ferry that will take us to the island. I never dreamed I'd be living on Prince Edward Island. It's always seemed so romantic to me. Right now, I feel like it's the vessel taking me to my doom. Marriage, doom. They sound different to me." They watched as people were unloaded from the ferry, and then their things were loaded. "I'm so excited." "Really?" "I couldn't tell," Elizabeth said. "What's wrong with Catherine? Any idea?" Josie shook her head. "I have no idea. I know she's sick, and that's all I know. I think Nettie is taking good care of her. Maybe we should help. If she's still ill when we get settled in, I plan to help as much as I can." Josie frowned over at the girl in question, who was sitting on a bench, looking very weak. Miss Hazel walked over to the two of them. "Josie, I don't think I have ever seen a bride quite so excited to meet her future groom. Most are at least a little bit nervous. Worrying will only give me a stomachache. I'm about to meet the man I'm going to spend the rest of my life with. I'll take one look at him, and I will fall in love." Josie grinned. "I have to be optimistic about it all. I'm sure it's going to be just fine. You said you'd met his brother, Bert. His brother was a fine man. That doesn't automatically mean that Ernie is. I don't think he'd be anything else, seeing as how he's one of Canada's finest, but you never know. There are crooks in every profession." Josie put her hands on her hips and turned to Miss Hazel. "Do you realize you sound like you're trying your hardest to make me worry? I don't want to worry, so I'm going to ignore you. You may pester Elizabeth if she is all right with it. If not, I'm going to have to ask you to stop because we're lifelong friends, and no one pesters my lifelong friends." Elizabeth shook her head. "Don't worry, Miss Hazel. I'm nervous enough for the both of us." Miss Hazel shrugged. "You don't have to be nervous, but it is rather normal." Josie flung her arms out to the sides and spun in a slow circle. "It's a beautiful spring day, I'm about to meet my future husband, and I refuse to be down about anything." Miss Hazel patted Josie's arm. "I saw you got a letter from your father Monday. What did it say?" Josie smiled sweetly. "It said that Mrs. Melton was upset with me because she had planned to spend the week I was in class getting ready for the wedding. Instead, she had to keep my father's house, and she would probably be angry with me for a very long time. He claimed I was a bit selfish in my actions as well, but I ignored that. I devoted 5 years to caring for his home. That wasn't selfish at all." She looked up at the sky and noted a cloud floating by. Wouldn't you say that cloud looks like a motor car? I want to ride in one someday. Miss Hazel exchanged a look with Elizabeth, but neither of them said a word about Josie's abrupt change of subject, and for that Josie was glad. She was sick of worrying and feeling guilty for no reason. From now on, she was going to be optimistic and ready to take on the world, no matter what it tried to throw at her. It was time for them to get onto the ferry, so she made sure she was one of the first to get on, with Elizabeth at her side. It seemed that Elizabeth would always be her trusty sidekick, and she couldn't be happier. As they stood on the ferry, Josie felt the sea air blowing across her face. Elizabeth. We're going to live on an island. We can go to the ocean any time we want. The sea air will be a regular part of our lives. We are the luckiest women in the entire world. Elizabeth looked over her shoulder at Catherine, who looked perfectly miserable. I have a feeling I may know who the unluckiest woman in the world is. Josie sighed and looked back at Catherine. Maybe we should go help, though it does look as though Nettie and Miss Hazel have everything under control. Yes, it does. I need to stop worrying about everything. Yes, you do. Josie linked her arm with Elizabeth's. In just a few hours, we're going to be married to Mounties. Canada's finest. She sighed. Mounties are so romantic. Islands are so romantic. If our lives aren't a perfect fairy tale, I'm going to be very surprised. Elizabeth just shook her head. Chapter 2. Ernie sat with Aaron, a fellow Mountie, waiting for their brides to arrive off the ferry in Charlottetown. Michael had stayed behind to make sure nothing went awry in Bison Bay. He had no idea what they'd say to Timothy's bride, but surely they'd think of something. I'm sorry, but your fiancé's throat was slit in the middle of the night, was probably not the kindest thing they could say. Ernie was sad about his friend's death still, but part of him was wildly excited to see his bride get off that ferry. He wanted to meet her and welcome her into his life. As the new commander of their post, he felt he should be at least a bit serious, but he couldn't find it in him. Not unless he was thinking about how he'd found Timothy. When he saw the ferry pull in, he elbowed Aaron, who had been sitting silently beside him. It's here. We're about to meet our brides. Aaron looked at Ernie, whose idea this whole bride thing had been to begin with. Do you really think we're doing the right thing? Ernie nodded. Yes, I really do. I'm tired of being alone. Aren't you? Aaron nodded, his eyes glued to the ferry. Let's go. Ernie said, walking toward the dock. I'm ready to meet the woman I will spend the rest of my life with. He rubbed his hands together excitedly. I'm glad we brought both of the automobiles, he said. We'll each take our own bride and one of the others. Isn't the matchmaker coming, too? Aaron asked, slightly confused. You take your bride and the other two brides, and I'll take the matchmaker, Ernie said. Sound like a plan? All except for one thing. Aaron said, pointing. What? Ernie hated when his plans didn't work out the first time, even if they were plans he'd made up just moments before. There's another Mountie on that ferry. I bet he's coming to take Timothy's place. Ernie nodded. All right then, I'll take the new Mountie and Miss Hazel, along with my bride. You get the other three. That's a plan. Aaron walked toward the dock, but stopped short. Which one is my bride? Ernie shrugged. How am I supposed to know that? They aren't exactly wearing their names on signs around their necks. I'm going to just shout out Josephine and see who looks. Maybe you should shout out your bride's name. Whatever it is. It's Elizabeth. Aaron frowned. I'm not sure shouting her name out is a smart idea. Why? Don't you think she knows her name? Of course she knows her name, but she's not expecting some stranger to shout it at her. It's not going to bug my Josephine. Watch. Ernie stepped forward and bellowed, Josephine, at the top of his lungs. A young lady grinned in his direction and raised her hand in a wave, taking the arm of another woman and dragging her toward them. When they were close, she stopped in front of him. I'm Josie. Ernie? Yes, I'm Ernie. He looked the girl up and down, studying her face. She was pretty, but not in a basic way. No, she had an energy about her that Ernie found himself drawn to. Without thinking twice, he stepped forward, wrapped his arms around her, and kissed her. Josie was surprised by the kiss, but not at all unhappy with it. She put her arms around his neck and kissed him back for all she was worth. Never having been kissed before, she wasn't sure if she was going about it correctly, but he didn't seem to have any complaints. After a minute, he lifted his head. "Well, hello, Josie." She grinned, feeling the tingling that had started in her lips spread throughout her entire body. "Hello, Ernie." She had quite forgotten that she stood on the dock and that people were milling all around them. "I think I'm going to like you." Ernie laughed. "I certainly hope so." He looked over at Aaron, seeing that his friend looked like he was frozen. Why, Ernie had no idea, and he didn't care as much as he probably should have. At that moment, the only thing he could bring himself to care about was his sweet bride. "We need to head back to Bison Bay. The pastor is waiting for us at the church." Ernie looked around. "Where are the other women?" Josie shrugged, obviously as caught up with him as he was with her. "I think Miss Hazel is bringing them toward us. Nettie is with Catherine. I'm not sure what's wrong with Catherine, but she's been very ill on the journey here. She's going to be even more ill when she realizes Timothy died." Ernie shook his head, suddenly feeling very sorry for the woman who he had yet to meet. Catherine came here to marry Michael, not Timothy. Poor Nettie. Josie looked over her shoulder to see Miss Hazel and Nettie on either side of Catherine, helping her off the ferry. The Mountie who had been on their train was just behind them. Maybe the Mountie who came to take Timothy's place will marry her. "We haven't met him yet, so we have no idea what he's like." Ernie's focus was on the man walking toward them. He abruptly released Josie, almost causing her to fall, before walking over to the new Mountie. "I'm Ernest Keeler, the new commander in Bison Bay." "You are?" "I'm Bryce Muir, newly assigned to help out in Bison Bay." "It's good to meet you, sir. Call me Ernie. We'll be working together." He looked around him and saw that an older woman was there with two young women. "You arrived on the same ship with all of our mail order brides. You wouldn't be looking for a bride, would you?" Bryce's eyes grew wide, and he seemed to look at the healthier of the two women, before he shook his head. "No, I'm here to do a job. A bride is not part of it." Ernie sighed. "Can't blame me for trying, can you?" He turned back to Josie, offering her his arm. "We brought 2 cars to take everyone back to Bison Bay. We left Michael behind because we needed someone to keep the peace while we were off cavorting and planning to marry whoever we found on the ferry." He looked down at Josie and smiled. "I appear to have won the jackpot, though, so don't anyone get their hopes up. This one is mine." Josie giggled a little, looking up at Ernie with stars in her eyes. He was exactly what she'd expected him to be, perfect in every way. "How are we dividing up to ride to Bison Bay?" Ernie looked over at Aaron. "Aaron's taking all the brides, but you." "I'm taking you, Bryce, and Miss Hazel." He hadn't really learned any of their names. Names weren't a strong point of his, and he did well to remember the name of the girl who had come to marry him. Aaron nodded, not speaking. Ernie sensed that something was wrong with him, but he was too infatuated with the woman clinging to his arm to ask. Maybe later. Once they'd all piled into the 2 automobiles, Ernie set off for Bison Bay. "I hope you'll love your new home as much as I do," he said softly to Josie, who was sitting beside him in the front seat. "I tend to be happy wherever I am. As long as you don't kick me out of the house, with nowhere to live, I'll smile every day." For a moment, Josie frowned, thinking about the situation she'd just left, but then her smile returned. Ernie was beside her, and he was everything she'd imagined he'd be and more. When they reached Bison Bay, another Mountie came to greet the cars. He seemed to be searching the 2 vehicles, trying to figure out which bride was his. Ernie jerked his thumb toward the other automobile as he got out of the car, walking around and opening Josie's door. "I think we should all go see the pastor," Ernie said, anxious to get the wedding over with. Well, more than anything, he was anxious to take his bride home, but his thoughts were running a little bit too much toward the wedding night. Nettie frowned. I think we need to get Catherine settled. There's no way she's going to be ready to marry until she's feeling better. Michael walked over to the two ladies, obviously concerned. Aaron still looked bewildered to Ernie, but he decided not to worry about what anyone else was doing at that moment. He was going to take his bride to the church and marry her. What else could he do with someone so beautiful beside him? Whatever anyone else is doing, Josie and I are going to go see Pastor Bouvier. I'm getting married before the sun sets. With those words, Ernie and Josie started toward the church. You're everything I hoped you'd be, Josie said softly. How had God known that she was looking for a man just like Ernie? It was as if every dream, prayer, and wish had all been granted at the same time. Ernie grinned at her. I was just thinking the same thing. I can't believe you're about to be my wife. She smiled happily. It's so nice when things work out just the way they ought to, isn't it? It is. They reached the church, and Ernie opened the door, waiting for her to precede him inside. It was then that he noticed that Aaron and Elizabeth had followed them. It was sad that he wasn't even noticing the people around him because he was so involved with his soon-to-be wife. Pastor Bouvier was waiting for them at the front of the church, and Ernie walked down the aisle with his bride on his arm. Pastor, this is Josie McClain. She's here to marry me. The pastor was an older man, and he nodded with a smile. All right. Are you ready now? Josie nodded, feeling as if her face would break if she smiled any bigger than she was. Ernie had taken one look at her and kissed her. What more could she ask for in a husband? 5 minutes later, the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, and Josie turned to Ernie, anticipating her second kiss from him with a smile. She was sure her toes would curl in her shoes, and passion would zing through her entire body again. Ernie grinned at her, pulling her to him and lowering his mouth to hers. He kept the kiss short, just long enough to fill his body with pleasure and his mind with his sweet bride. When he raised his head, he grabbed her bag and offered her his arm. Shall we go see our home? Absolutely. I can't wait. Neither can I, he said under his breath. He was sure they were talking about different things they couldn't wait for, but he didn't say anything. He was too content. He walked the short distance to his government-issued cabin, certain she would take one look at the place and want to run, but she didn't. Instead, she walked through it slowly, her eyes taking in everything about it. Is it all right if I make curtains and a tablecloth? I can see just how the cabin will look with a bit of care from me. She clapped her hands together, already excited at the prospect of making this place a home they could both be proud of. She knew that she was the perfect wife for her Ernie, the same as he was the perfect husband for her. Absolutely, you do whatever you want. I have an account at the general store, which is right next to the church. You go there and get whatever you need to spruce this place up, and I'll make sure old Joe gives you whatever you want. Old Joe, she asked, a giggle forming inside her. Were people really called that? I don't know where he got the name, but he does have a 6-year-old son named Joe, so that might be it. He's only about 30. Ernie had never really bothered himself with those things. Old Joe had introduced himself as Old Joe when he came into town, and that was that as far as he was concerned. That's probably where he got the name then. Josie grinned at him, already enjoying every moment with this man. How could she have found perfection by answering a letter? She walked into the tiny little area that would be called a kitchen and opened the icebox. No food? Ernie shrugged. I don't cook. There's a small cafe in town, and I eat most of my meals there. Do you want to keep doing that, or should we go to the store? He offered her his arm. You want to go now? Only if you want to eat supper tonight. As they walked, he pointed out different things in town. That's where the pastor lives. And that's where the farmers in town come and sell their produce. Tell me about yourself, she said softly. I know your name is Ernie, and you have a brother who is also a Mountie. What else should I know about you? Ernie shrugged. My brother always wanted to be a Mountie, but I figured I'd do something spectacular. Like be a bank robber or something. Then I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my life behind bars, so I chose the right side of the law, and my brother and I went to the academy together. What's your brother like? Well, he's quieter than me. He was married to a really sweet woman whom he met while we were at the academy. They had twins, and then she died birthing their third child, who was a little boy. He had a really hard time trying to raise his little girls, who were just 3, on his own, so he sent for a mail-order bride. He seems really happy with her, so I figured I'd get a bride of my own. Makes sense to me. They walked into the general store, and Josie collected a few things she would need to prepare meals and set them on the counter, where a man who looked to be in his early 30s was standing. Ernie nodded to old Joe. This is my wife, Josie. She's going to be able to put anything she wants on my account. Old Joe raised an eyebrow. Anything? No limits? Ernie shook his head. No. I trust her. All right. Old Joe made a note on his ledger. She's pretty. Yes, she is. I think she's going to be the best wife a man could ask for. Ernie watched her walk around the store, carefully contemplating what she was going to buy. Her skin was alabaster, and her hair seemed to shine. When she brought the last of her purchases to the counter, she smiled at him. That'll get us through the weekend. It was Wednesday afternoon, and she would shop again on Monday. That would work out perfectly. She was already mentally scheduling out her week. After old Joe had put their purchases on the ledger, Ernie picked up the box everything was in and carried it out the door. The box was heavy, but he was looking forward to being able to eat home-cooked meals. How long had it been since he'd had a meal prepared for him by someone who cared for him? Too long. That was for certain. When they reached the cabin again, she immediately began putting her purchases away, looking through the cabinets to find some pots and pans. Are you hungry now? She asked. I can start supper. Ernie walked toward her, catching her by the shoulders and pulling her to him. I have to make sure kissing you is as wonderful as I remember first. Josie laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. I'm glad to help you with your memories. He lowered his head, capturing her lips with his. Her response to him was greater than any other woman he'd ever kissed. It was like because she knew they were married, she responded more strongly. When he lifted his head, her lips were moist and swollen a bit. I think I'm going to like being married to you, Josie Keeler. She grinned. I've never been married before, so I can't be quite as certain as you seem to be, but I think I'll like being married to you, too. She winked at him before turning to start their supper. It was already late afternoon, and she didn't want to have to spend a lot of time, so she had purchased a loaf of bread. She'd make sandwiches tonight, and she would wait to start dazzling him with her culinary skills until tomorrow. She quickly cut strips of bacon and put them onto the stove, frying them crisp, surprised when she realized he was sitting at the table watching her cook his supper. You don't have to watch me, she told him. Why don't you do something you want to do, and I'll call you as soon as our meal is ready. I want to watch you, he answered. There's just something about the way you move about in the kitchen that has me mesmerized. She laughed softly. Well, watch away then. But don't get mad at me if you don't get everything you need to do done, just because you were distracted by me. She couldn't admit it, but she loved that he wanted to watch her. It made her feel beautiful and special. She needed that with the way her father had kicked her out of his house. She frowned, really not wanting to talk or think about her father or her new stepmother. She quickly made the sandwiches and served them, sitting down beside him. Oh, drinks. What do you like to drink with your supper? Water? Milk? Water is fine. He liked coffee a lot, but he tried not to drink it in the evenings, because he didn't want to be awake all night. She got water for them both and sat down, putting her hand in his. Are you going to pray? He grinned, saying a quick prayer with her. Together, they were going to be happy. He could feel it. Chapter 3. After supper dishes were done, Ernie suggested they go for a walk. It was early spring and still a bit chilly at night, but they were hardy Canadians, and neither of them would be hurt by a chill in the air. They walked together, hand in hand, leaving the town via the main road. It's very peaceful here, Josie said. I've never lived anywhere but the capital, so this is very nice for me. I love it here, but it's not always safe to be out at night. What do you mean? Well, we have this flying squirrel that's out and about at night. He's a real menace, she laughed softly. How can a flying squirrel be a menace? They sounded like cute, cuddly creatures to her. He likes to poop in people's hair, and he has perfect aim. Really? She found the idea very amusing, but she knew she wouldn't if it was her hair he pooped in. Really? He likes to steal things, too, so don't leave anything outside at night. Why just at night? Josie knew little about any type of squirrels, but she was relatively certain she'd never seen a flying squirrel. Hopefully he could teach her something about them. They're nocturnal, Ernie explained. That's interesting. Josie loved to learn new things, and she was grateful to have married a man who could teach her. Abruptly, he stopped walking and pulled her into his arms. When I wrote for a wife, I knew one of the first things I wanted to do was kiss her in the moonlight. What if she doesn't want to be kissed in the moonlight? Josie asked. He frowned. You don't want to be kissed? Oh, I have a feeling kissing is going to be one of my favorite activities. I just wondered how you would have felt if it wasn't. She felt freer with her new husband than she had ever felt in her life. She hoped every day could be the same as that one. Forever. He laughed. I think I'm really going to enjoy having you for a wife, Josie. I hope so because I think I'm going to enjoy having you for a husband. Ernie pulled her to him and kissed her softly. There, that's one more thing I can cross off my list. List? She asked. Sure. I made a mental list of all the things I wanted to do with my bride when she got here, and here you are, so I can cross kissing you in the moonlight off the list. All right. I'll let you do that. What's next on the list? I'm not going to tell you that. Why not? Because I think if I said it out loud, it might embarrass both of us. Josie blushed, laughing slightly. Oh, I see. One of those things you shouldn't have been thinking about before I was your wife. Probably shouldn't have been, but that sure didn't stop me. I never claimed to be perfect. Ernie turned around and walked back toward their little cabin, planning to cross the next item off his list just as soon as he could. I have a feeling you're just perfect for me, and that's good enough. I hope it is. I think I'm going to enjoy married life a great deal. After Ernie had left for work the next morning, Josie cleaned the cabin. She dealt with the small pile of clothes he'd left dirty in one corner of his cabin, and she scrubbed the floors and every window. Thankfully the entire cabin was only about the size of her kitchen back home, so it was an easy task. She was finished with all that before noon, and then she started looking around for something else to do. She couldn't help but wonder where Catherine and Nettie had ended up and whether or not Elizabeth was happy with her errand. She didn't know if she could find them, but she started to walk toward the middle of town, hoping one of them would be out and about so she could talk to someone. She had spent altogether too much time alone at her father's house, and she didn't want that trend to continue. She planned to be the social butterfly of Bison Bay. When she was just past the church, she spotted Elizabeth and called out to her. Elizabeth. Her friend turned to her with a smile. Josie, it's good to see you. I had no idea where you'd ended up. I'm on the other end of town, Elizabeth said, pointing in the direction Josie had been walking. Where are you? Back that way. Do you want to come visit? Elizabeth sighed. I have too much to do to come visit today. You could come see me if you're finished with your chores, though. I'd love that. I want to stop in at the general store and buy the fabric I forgot to get last night. I want to make curtains and a tablecloth for my new home. It's tiny, but it's just right for me and Ernie. Josie sighed happily. I hope you're just as happy with Aaron as I am with Ernie. I feel like God made him just for me. Elizabeth just shrugged noncommittally. Let's go to the store together and get what you need, and you can work on the curtains while I bake bread for today. Josie walked along with her friend, talking to her happily. Have you heard where Catherine and Nettie ended up? Yes, they moved into Michael's cabin for now, and Michael is staying with Bryce. Michael and Catherine will marry as soon as she's better. Walking into the store, Elizabeth looked around. I need to find the flour. You get what you need, and I'll meet you at the front. Josie wondered why her friend seemed a little bit down, but she wasn't going to ask. It was none of her business really. If Elizabeth wanted to talk, Josie would listen. Otherwise, she was happy to tell Elizabeth about her amazing new husband. As they left the store and walked toward the cabin Elizabeth shared with Aaron, Josie asked, "Have you seen Miss Hazel?" Elizabeth shook her head. Not since we got to Bison Bay. I wonder where she disappeared to. She's probably helping take care of Catherine, Josie said. We probably should be helping take care of Catherine, too. Probably, but we have new marriages to figure out. The others don't. Elizabeth stopped in front of a little cabin and opened the door. Josie thought her friend's wording was strange. What was there to figure out about a new marriage? You took walks in the moonlight, made love, and enjoyed each other's company. Easy enough. Tell me a little about Aaron, she said. Elizabeth put her purchases on the table. He's a Mountie. Josie laughed. Well, I knew that. What more is there to say? Elizabeth asked, obviously evading the question. Josie hoped the other couple wasn't already having trouble with their marriage. Ernie and I went for a long walk under the stars last night. It was really nice. That does sound nice. Elizabeth went about mixing up the dough for bread, not offering any information about her new marriage. Josie sighed, wishing conversations weren't so stilted with Elizabeth all of a sudden, but she couldn't let herself be too upset over it. She carefully cut out the curtains she wanted to make and started sewing. She hadn't measured, but she was good at guessing how big something needed to be after seeing it. I think curtains and a tablecloth will make my new little cabin a home, Josie said, trying to make the conversation about anything but her friend's new marriage. That's a good idea, Elizabeth said. When I finish mine, I could help you with yours, Josie offered. Are you already looking for things to do? Elizabeth asked with a laugh. Yes. I shouldn't have bought bread from the store last night because I could have had something more to do today if I hadn't. My kitchen back in Ottawa was as big as my whole cabin here, and I had no help keeping the house clean. This is going to be a struggle until I start having children. You're already thinking of children? Of course I am. I want half a dozen at least. Josie had never hidden the fact that she wanted children. She had been an only child, and she wouldn't wish that on anyone. A child's first playmate should always be a sibling. Have you never been nervous about anything in your life? Never not wanted to grasp the bull by the horns and live out whatever dream you had? Josie smiled. Did I ever tell you why I decided to be a mail order bride? No. I just assumed you were looking for adventure and decided to marry a total stranger. I've kept house for my father since my mother died 5 years ago. Father started courting a few months back, and a couple of weeks ago, my father and his lady friend told me they were marrying. His fiancée made it very clear that I would no longer be welcome in her home. She suggested I go be a nanny for her brother and his wife even though her brother has a reputation for chasing after the hired help. Josie shook her head. I left the house, understandably upset. I ran into Miss Hazel, and she showed me Ernie's letter. I decided that I would no longer be someone who lived under another person's thumb. I was tired of being pushed around. Elizabeth looked stunned. You used to let people push you around? Until just a couple of weeks ago, I did. I went home that afternoon and told my father I would be gone in a week. He would need to find someone to take my place until the wedding. Josie didn't bother to mention the tears she'd shed. She didn't talk about the dances she had not gone to so she could play hostess for her father, the endless days of cooking and cleaning for a man who had no gratitude for anything she did. I'm sorry that happened to you, Josie. Josie shrugged. I'm not. I was at first, but now I've embraced my new life. I have a husband that I could easily fall in love with. A life in a small town instead of the big city. Do you realize the air smells so much better here? We're by the ocean. She shook her head adamantly. No, I'm not sad that I left that life behind. I'm only happy that I found this one. I think that's wonderful, Elizabeth said. I'm going to strive to be more positive about this whole situation. Situation? You mean your marriage? When Elizabeth only grunted noncommittally, Josie frowned and got back to her sewing. Elizabeth was hiding something from her, and she didn't like it. The other girl didn't know that she was the first and only friend Josie'd had since her mother died, and she wasn't about to tell her now. Not now that she knew Elizabeth didn't feel like she could confide in her. After a couple of hours of sitting and visiting, Josie got to her feet. I need to hurry home and fix supper for my big, strong Mountie. Elizabeth smiled. I'll see you soon. Come and see me again tomorrow if you have time. I'll see if I can. As she walked home, Josie thought about Ernie. The only thing she could really complain about was he wasn't as tall as she would have liked. He was still taller than she was, though. He was a good man, and she was proud to call him her husband. As soon as she got home, she started potatoes baking in the oven. She would make pork chops and green beans to go with them. Ernie would be pleased with her meal, because Ernie seemed to always be pleased. She had married a truly affable man, and her life couldn't be better. Well, maybe if she was expecting. She hummed to herself as her supper cooked. She brought in the clothes from the line and folded them, putting them where they went. She found a few things to mend and got that done, and then it was time for supper. Only there was no Ernie there. She checked the time by the mantel clock. He'd said he'd be home by 6. It was 10 after. Leaving all the food in the oven to stay warm, she hung the curtains she'd finished, and she'd been right. They did give the house a homey look. At 7, he still wasn't home. She thought about going to the Mountie office, which he had pointed out the day before, but she wasn't sure if she was welcome there. Instead, she sat at the table and picked up a book, losing herself in the written word. At 9, he still wasn't there, and she was sure supper was ruined. She decided to eat herself and not wait any longer. She could make him something else when he finally got home, and then she remembered what he'd told her had happened to Timothy. What if he was in the Mountie office right then, all of his blood flowing out of his body and onto his desk? She shook her head. She refused to think so pessimistically. She was going to only think about positive things. She'd promised herself. As soon as she finished eating, she put his food onto a plate, covered the plate with a towel, and pulled her shawl over her shoulders. Stepping outside, she ran into Miss Hazel almost immediately. What are you doing wandering the streets of Bison Bay in the middle of the night? I was looking for you. Miss Hazel responded. What are you doing? Ernie hasn't come home from work yet, so I thought I'd take him his supper before it's completely ruined. Josie didn't let worry enter her voice, because she refused to believe there was anything wrong. Well, I'll walk with you then. Miss Hazel linked her arm with Josie's, and the two women walked together toward the jail. What is that animal? She pointed toward something in the sky. Josie cringed as the flying squirrel glided over her. It's a flying squirrel. He's known for pooping on the heads of everyone in town. Miss Hazel started laughing hysterically. Well, he just got his next victim. Who would have thought I'd ever have squirrel poop in my hair? She shook her head. That animal needs a name. What do you think of Rocky? Miss Hazel had already named an animal Rocky in the past few months, but no one would know that but her. It wasn't like her life was a series of books people were reading. I don't know. Josie responded. It seems to me that Bullseye would be a better name for that squirrel. No, I think that squirrel should be named Rocky, so I do hereby declare that's his name. Well, maybe Squishy. No, it has to be Rocky. Miss Hazel stopped at the Mountie office. Are you happy, Josie? Josie nodded. I really am. Ernie is practically perfect, and I know I'm going to have the happiest marriage in the entire history of marriages. Miss Hazel smiled at that and kissed Josie on the cheek. I hope you're right. I'm heading back to Ottawa tomorrow, but I wanted to check on you first. I knew somehow that you'd be happy. I'm happy because I refuse to be the alternative. Josie smiled. I'll miss you. Thank you for all you've done for me. Miss Hazel waved and was gone. Josie still wasn't sure where she was staying, but it didn't really matter. What mattered was that Miss Hazel knew where she was staying. Josie pushed open the door to the jail and stepped inside, finding Ernie sitting at the desk there, a mound of paperwork on his desk. He looked up, and his eyes widened. "I brought you some supper," Josie announced. Ernie got to his feet, looking a bit sheepish. "I was buried in paperwork, so I went to the cafe for supper." She frowned at him. "You said you'd be home at 6, so I had supper ready at 6. Why didn't you at least come home for supper?" "I cooked for you and everything." Ernie didn't want to admit the truth. He'd gotten so busy, he'd forgotten he was married, so his mind raced to find an excuse. "I'm sorry, Josie. I just didn't think I had the time to go home for supper. I brought the meal from the cafe back here." "All right," she said softly, but her feelings were hurt, and it wasn't all right. Her perfect man had quickly become imperfect in her eyes. "I'd appreciate it if you'd send word if you won't be coming home for supper from now on." He hurried around his desk and took the plate from her, putting it onto his desk before pulling her fully into his arms. "I'm sorry if I worried you." "It's fine," she said, even though it wasn't. She wanted a good marriage, not one filled with fights and bickering about little things. "When will you be home?" He glanced at his paperwork and reached over to turn the switch to shut off the lamp on his desk. "Right now. All this can wait for tomorrow." He was more interested in his wife than he was work, now that he remembered he was married. Thank heavens she hadn't realized what had really happened. He knew her feelings would be hurt. She smiled at him sweetly. "That sounds good to me. Home is where I want to be with you every evening." It was true. She was already falling in love with practically perfect Ernie, who needed to let her know when he'd be late. Chapter 4. After Ernie left for work the following morning, Josie realized she had bread to bake, and she was thrilled to get started on the time-consuming task because she needed to fill her time. She'd make the tablecloth later in the day, but she could do that at Elizabeth's house while she and Elizabeth talked about superficial things. She couldn't help but wonder what was wrong with her friend, but she wasn't going to press her. If Elizabeth wanted her to know, she'd tell her. She baked the bread, and while she was at it, she baked a cake for dessert that night. Hopefully Ernie would do as she asked and send her a message if he was going to be late again. She was still a bit perturbed with him for not letting her know what was happening the night before, but she hadn't said anything, wanting to keep the peace in her household. Of course, if his lateness continued for a long period, keeping the peace would mean nothing to her. She would let him know exactly what she thought of him for not communicating. After she had eaten a lunch of his leftovers from the night before, she put her sewing into a basket and traipsed down the street to her friend's cabin, knocking on the door. Elizabeth opened the door wide to invite her in. "I have some mending to do today, so if you'd like, we can sit together at the table and sew." "I'd like that a lot," Josie said with a smile. She had no idea what she was going to do when her tablecloth was finished, because it was the last task she had for the house. She would have to find something else to do, and she had absolutely nothing in mind. "Have you met other people in town yet?" Elizabeth shook her head. "Not really. Maybe tomorrow we could bake some cookies and wander around, trying to meet people and bribing them to like us with cookies." Elizabeth laughed. "Everyone's going to like you, Josie. You're so full of life. No bribery will be needed." But her own husband didn't like her enough to come home from work, so maybe bribery was needed. "I might try it anyway. Do we have a school here in town?" "From what I understand there is a school, but I haven't gone looking for it yet." "Why?" Josie sighed heavily. "This is the last project that needs to be done around my house. By this evening, I'm going to be bored out of my mind and needing something to do. I like to read, but I have no books left that I haven't read 3 dozen times, and I need to be occupied." "Oh." Elizabeth's eyes grew wide. "You could see how Catherine is doing? Maybe you could give Nettie a break from watching over her." Josie nodded. "If I knew where they were, I'd do just that. Ernie didn't come home last night. I was waiting and waiting, but he was doing paperwork." He even had supper at the cafe and didn't send word. She didn't want to admit her marriage wasn't perfect, but she had to talk to someone, and Elizabeth seemed the logical answer. Of course Elizabeth wouldn't talk to her about what was wrong, so maybe Josie should keep her feelings and opinions to herself. Really? I know all of the Mounties are trying to figure out who killed their former leader. Now that Ernie is the leader, I'm sure he has a lot on his mind. I'm sure he does, Josie said softly, knowing she was being too critical. I saw Miss Hazel last night. Have you seen the flying squirrel here? Or heard about him? Elizabeth shook her head. There's a flying squirrel? Yes, he only comes out at night, and he poops on people's heads. I told Miss Hazel we should name him Bullseye, because a squirrel who can aim that well while flying is something of a marvel in my opinion, but she wants to name him Rocky. So I guess he's Rocky. I had no idea there was a squirrel like that around here. Have you seen him? Yes, we saw him last night, and he pooped on Miss Hazel's head, and she laughed like a loon. Who would laugh at being poop-bombed by a squirrel other than Miss Hazel? Josie shook her head. She loved the old woman, but sometimes she seemed to be downright batty. I have no idea, Elizabeth said, her eyes amused. I do need to make a quilt for my bed here. Would you like to help me with that? It could be your next project to keep yourself from losing your mind. I would adore that. I do hope I get pregnant really quickly, so I'll have a baby to occupy my time. I can't wait to see Ernie's baby. I'm sure the first will be a boy. We should call him Oscar or Elmo. Why those names? Josie shrugged. They just seem to go with Ernie and Bert, don't they? Bert is Ernie's twin. Elizabeth just continued to look at Josie like she'd lost her mind. I never really thought of those names as going together. Well, they just seem to in my head. I'm not even sure why. Josie looked back down at her tablecloth and worked on hemming it more. I'm going to make stew for supper tonight, and if Ernie doesn't come home at 6, I'm going to march straight down to that jail and take him a big bowl of it. He needs to eat, and he needs to eat my food, not cafe food. What's wrong with cafe food? Have you eaten there? Elizabeth asked. Certainly not. I like my own cooking too much to be caught in a dining establishment. I wonder if you'll feel that way in 6 months, or if you'll be ready to eat out then. Probably depends on whether or not I'm expecting by then. All Josie could really think about were the children she so desperately wanted to have. Children who would be with her all the time, even if her husband was late coming home for supper. When it was time to start cooking that evening, she folded up her finished tablecloth and said goodbye to her friend. I'll come back tomorrow afternoon, and we'll start on your quilt. As she walked home, Josie couldn't help but wonder if Ernie would be home on time. She understood his need to work to find out who had killed his friend, but he really needed to let her know what was happening when he stayed late. She got home and started the stew. As soon as it was cooking, she spread her new tablecloth on the table and smiled at how good it looked. It matched the curtains perfectly. Then she went outside to the yard to pick some of the wildflowers she'd seen growing there. PEI was warmer than Ottawa had been, and more of the signs of spring were in the air. She couldn't wait until summer. Maybe someday soon, Ernie would take her to the beach. The next day was Saturday, and hopefully he'd be off work, but they all seemed to be working extra hours at the moment. There was something amiss with the way Timothy had died, and she knew it was a priority for the Mounties to find out what exactly had happened. When she had enough flowers for a pretty centerpiece for the table, she went back inside to stir the stew before arranging the flowers nicely in a glass. There were no vases in the cabin, and she decided they would need to get one. She refused to always put flowers in glasses for the middle of her table. They just weren't pretty enough, and she wanted to be surrounded by pretty things. She knew they didn't have a great deal of money, but she was creative, and she could make it work with just a few basic things. The table was set, and there was a candle in the middle of the table with the lights turned off, lending an atmosphere of romance to the cabin when it was 6. She sat down and waited, praying he wouldn't be late this time. She promised herself that if he wasn't there at 6:15, she was going to march herself right down to that jail with both of their suppers and eat there with him. She was on her way out the door at 6:20, a picnic basket packed with dishes in one hand and her stew pot dangling by the handle from the other. If the man wouldn't come home for supper, she'd go to him every night if that's what it took. When she reached the jail, he was sitting at his desk, which was once again covered in paperwork. He didn't look like he had any intention of leaving anytime soon. She set the pot on one chair and the picnic basket on another, and then she used a second desk on the other side of the room for a table, covering it with the tablecloth before she set their dishes out on it, and she served 2 bowls of the stew. She cut 2 pieces of bread off the loaf she'd baked and put a small ball of butter in the middle of the table. She'd purchased the ball of butter, but she had found a butter churn, and she planned to start making her own butter just as soon as possible. The longer her chores took her, the less unhappy she'd be. She had to be busy to be happy, whether she liked that truth about herself or not. Ernie sat and watched her transform his office into a dining room, a slight smile on his face. He'd once again forgotten to go home for supper, but thankfully he hadn't found his meal at the cafe. He was afraid she would be mortally offended if he avoided her cooking 2 nights in a row. The truth was he loved her cooking. He enjoyed being around her. His main problem was that once he was working, he forgot anything else in the world existed. He was going to have the other men remind him to go home. When she'd finished, Josie turned to Ernie. "I hope you're hungry, because I made enough to feed an army." Ernie nodded, getting up and walking over to her. He took her in his arms and kissed her softly. "Thank you for worrying about me sitting here hungry. It's my job as your wife." Josie sat down at one side of the desk while he sat at the other, her glass full of pink ladies' slippers looking out of place in the very masculine office. He took her hand and said a quiet prayer for them before taking a bite of the stew. He closed his eyes. "You definitely have a way with cooking, Josie." For a moment, he'd blanked on her name again, and he panicked slightly, proud of himself when he remembered it. He wished he wasn't so absent-minded about things, but he just was at times. He was good with details as long as they mattered for police business, but for things like his wife's name and remembering he needed to go home for supper, he was lost. "I'm glad you like it," she said with a smile. She'd noticed his hesitation over her name, but she'd thought nothing of it. He probably was just trying to swallow a chunk of meat that got caught in his throat. "How was your day?" He shrugged. "Busy. We're knee-deep in the investigation of Timothy's death, and I'm not pleased with what I'm finding." As soon as the words were out of his mouth, he remembered that he didn't want to talk to her about his work. She was such a happy woman that he was determined to never bring her down by talking about the realities of police work. "What about you? I made this tablecloth today, and I spent some time with my friend, Elizabeth, who married Aaron." She wanted to ask him if he knew anything about why the marriage of their friends was strained, but she didn't feel like she had a right to get the information that way. It should come from her friend or not at all. "That's nice. I'm glad you have a friend here. At least until we solve this murder, I'm not going to be able to be home early. Or at any kind of decent hour." He shook his head, glad he'd found something to blame his absent-mindedness on. It was better than admitting the truth. He couldn't remember that he was married from one moment to the next. When he was with her, she was everything. When he wasn't, she was out of his mind. "I understand the murder is important. What happened?" He shook his head. "You're too sweet to hear the details of any murder case. We'll talk about something else. Have you seen our squirrel yet?" After the murder was solved, he could start telling her about his days. Until then, he felt better keeping her in the dark. She nodded. "Miss Hazel and I were walking last night, and he did his business in her hair. She named him Rocky even though I said he should have been Bullseye." He chuckled. "I had no idea we were looking for a name for him, but I would have voted for Bullseye, too. Do you think we could change his name as soon as Miss Hazel leaves town?" "Probably not. Miss Hazel has a way of finding things out." She leaned forward and dropped her voice to a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if she's some sort of spy." He frowned at her. "Do you really wonder that? Did his wife have an imagination that was so overactive she saw a little old lady and imagined a spy? If so, that was scary." No, but it would be fun to imagine, wouldn't it? Josie grinned at him. I need more to do. What do you mean? He asked with a frown. You have the house to take care of. You have to cook. Yes, but those things don't take very long. I can get them done in a few hours, and then what do I do? I've been going over to Elizabeth's every day, but I can't do that forever. She's going to get sick of me in her house and kick me out. Is there something I can do to help you? I can do the jail laundry and make sure everything is clean for the next prisoner. Or I can cook for anyone you have in jail. Do you have people in jail often? Not very often. The blankets and sheets could probably use a good washing. I guess you can do that if you have nothing else to do. If she was already bored in their little town, they were going to have a problem because nothing very exciting ever happened. Except for the murder of a Mountie. She sighed heavily. I'll wash them, and that will keep me busy for an hour or two. If you hear of anyone in town hiring, let me know. I'd be happy to work. He frowned. It's my job to support you. You shouldn't have to work. But I may have to work to retain a shred of sanity. I really am not used to being idle. Before I came here, I was my father's housekeeper, cook, and hostess. He had parties for clients at least once a week, and I did everything by myself. It kept me busy. Why did you decide to be a mail-order bride? It sounds like you enjoyed doing all that. She nodded. I did enjoy it, but he was getting married, and his fiancée let me know that I was no longer welcome to live in his home, so I needed to move on. I thought being a mail-order bride was a good solution to the problem because I would have plenty to do as a new bride. But your house is tiny, and I can clean the whole thing in an hour. I've washed all the windows inside and out and scrubbed the floors. I've made curtains and a tablecloth. I've done all the laundry and your mending. What do I do now? He blinked at her. Have you always been this busy? Josie shrugged. It's a blessing and a curse. I love being busy. I love to work hard and have something to show for my day. But when I run out of things to do, I slowly go mad. I guess I could go from house to house in town and see if anyone needs help cooking or cleaning. Maybe someone will have children for me to watch. Ernie sighed, shaking his head. I'm thrilled to know you enjoy working so much, but that seems a bit excessive. I'll ask around town if anyone is looking to hire anyone. Would you be willing to donate your time if someone just needs help with one or two small things? As long as it keeps me busy, I'm thrilled to do anything. I'll sweep chimneys. I'll clean windows. I'll dance in the streets and sing for my supper. Can you sing? He asked suspiciously. Everyone with a voice can sing. I'm not saying anyone would want to listen to me, but I can sing. He laughed softly. You are going to lead me on a merry chase, aren't you, Josie? As long as what we do is merry, I'm happy. I just don't want you to get bored with me. Or want to get rid of me like my father did. As soon as the thought flashed through her mind, she thrust it away. She would not feel sorry for herself or dwell on her past. She was married to a wonderful, hard-working man, and she was going to have a good life. That's all there was to it. Ernie shook his head. I have a feeling life with you is never going to be boring. I can't wait until we can spend time together. As soon as I've tied up loose ends here, I'll be able to take weekends off again. For now, I'll only be able to take Sundays off. She sighed. I guess I'll visit Elizabeth again tomorrow. She said she needs to make a quilt for her bed, and I can help her with it. That'll keep me occupied for a little while. After that, I'm going to have to find something to do so I don't swing from the rope that hangs from the church bell. I have a feeling Pastor Bouvier would not be amused. Chapter 5. Josie spent the following morning baking cookies and cleaning her house again. There was very little to do cleaning-wise, but she needed to do something. She didn't feel like she could invade Elizabeth's house in the morning and the afternoon. Once she had the cookies done, she piled them all in a basket and covered them up with a napkin. She'd take some to the Mountie office, and then she'd share with whomever she happened to meet on her way to Elizabeth's. She hoped that it was easy to make friends at the church in town. She took a deep breath, remembering her vow to be positive. She knew it would be easy to make friends at church on Sunday, and she couldn't wait to begin the process. Making friends was one of the most important things she could do. She ate a quick lunch of the stew from the previous night and did the dishes before heading out of the house with the basket on her arm. She passed a young woman who was carrying a child. "Would you like a cookie?" she asked them both. The mother gave her a strange look, but the child took the cookie happily. "Thank you," the mother said softly, and then she moved on down the street. "I'm Josie Keeler," Josie called after them. The mother frowned at her over her shoulder and kept on walking. Josie sighed. "There is a way to make friends in this little town, and I'm going to find it." An older woman came out on her porch and put her hands on her hips. "Are you talking to yourself on the street? Don't you think that behavior is just a bit odd?" Josie smiled at the woman sweetly. "Maybe it is a tad bit odd. Do you have any chores you need help with, ma'am?" "I'm Josie Keeler, Ernie Keeler's wife." The woman tilted her head to one side, studying Josie. "I don't. But I have a friend who is housebound that I like to visit. There's always something to do at her house." Josie smiled. "That's what I'm looking for. As a new bride, I don't have a lot to do. My house is immaculate, and there seems to be a lack of useful things to do. If you can point me toward a way to be useful, I will be eternally grateful. I'm Agatha Johnson. My old friend Lillian is the one who's so sick. Come with me, and we'll see her." Josie fell into step beside the older woman. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Johnson. I hope you know how much this means to me." Mrs. Johnson just nodded. "You married one of the Mounties, did you?" She looked Josie up and down, as if she was trying to decide if she was good enough. Good enough for what, Josie didn't know. For the community? Or for Ernie? "I did. Ernie. He's the new leader, now that Timothy has been murdered." "What do you know about the murder?" Since Ernie wouldn't talk about it, she had to get her information from somewhere. "I know nothing about it, and for that I'm grateful." "You don't think you're going to be the one to solve the mystery of who killed him, do you?" "No, ma'am. I'm just curious. Ernie spends all day every day working, and it would be nice to know a little more about what he's doing." Mrs. Johnson shook her head. "If you wanted to know what your husband was up to, you shouldn't have married a Mountie. They can't tell you all they're doing, you know." "Well, sure, I know. But..." Josie knew Mrs. Johnson was right, but that didn't stifle her curiosity. "No buts. We're here." She knocked on the door and then walked in. "Lillian, I brought you a friend. She just married one of our Mounties, and she's looking for something to do." Lillian was sitting in a chair, her feet propped up before her. "Well, come over here and let me see you, girl." Josie walked over into the light from the window so the older woman could inspect her. She wasn't sure what she expected to see, but whatever she wanted, Josie was ready to do it. "Have you had lunch yet? I could fix something." "Yes, please fix something, but I'm afraid you'll have to clean my kitchen first." "If I find the energy to get into the kitchen to cook something, I certainly don't have the energy to clean. It's more important that I eat than I clean, so..." "Well, let's just say I can keep you busy for quite some time cleaning up after me." Josie put down her basket of cookies, clasping her hands together in excitement. "I need to tell my friend I found something to do, and I won't be visiting her today. I'll be back in 10 minutes. She was halfway to the door before she stopped to ask, "Should I knock? Or just come in?" "Oh, just come in," Lillian said, watching her. "Agatha will sit here with me, and we'll have a nice chat." Josie rushed out the door and down the street to Elizabeth's house, telling her friend excitedly that she'd found something to occupy her time, and she wouldn't bother her for a while. Elizabeth frowned. "You don't bother me." Josie shrugged. "I feel like I need to be doing something meaningful." "I told you that. I'll see you at church tomorrow." She rushed away, going back to Lillian's. Once she was inside, she looked around for a kitchen. She had to get to work. When she got into the kitchen, she stopped short, staring at the room. Lillian certainly hadn't exaggerated the mess. If anything, she'd understated it. If the woman had any pots and pans or dishes that were not piled on the counters, Josie would be shocked. It looked as if a tornado had come through the small kitchen. Josie smiled. It would take her hours to just get this kitchen clean so she could cook. Finally, she could do something meaningful. Other women would look at a task like this and feel overwhelmed. Josie was just thrilled to have work to do. 2 hours later, she stepped out of the kitchen. I'm finished cleaning the kitchen, so I'm going to look for something to cook. Do you have anything in particular you'd like? Lillian shrugged. To tell you the truth, I'm not exactly tasting things like I used to. You just make whatever you have the ingredients for, and I'll eat it gratefully. Josie wondered if she should ask what exactly was wrong with the older woman, but she realized that it didn't matter to her. As long as she could be useful, she'd do all she could. She found some chicken in the icebox, and after giving it a good sniff, she decided it was safe to use. She quickly cut it up and threw it in water to boil. She had what she needed for chicken and dumplings. She'd cut up some carrots for a vegetable, throw them into the pot, and the woman would have enough food for a few days. While it was boiling, she went into the dining room, dusting every surface and sweeping the floor. She scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees until it shone. When Josie was finished there, she went into the parlor, where the two women were sitting with filth all around them, seeming not to notice it. May I get you ladies to retire to the dining room table to talk? I have cookies in that basket, and I'd happily make you both tea. I'd like to clean in here next. Lillian carefully got to her feet, and Josie picked up her basket, walking as close to the older woman as she could. She didn't want her to fall. Once Josie had tea and cookies in front of the older women, served on Lillian's beautiful tea service, with little pink flowers, she turned her attention to the parlor. She made short work of the room, knowing the women would want to come back there to sit when they had finished with their tea. As soon as she finished, she walked back to the dining room. The parlor is ready for you to return. May I start on the other rooms, Lillian? She was excited to have this entire house as a project. Lillian gave Agatha a startled look before nodding. Yes, of course, but don't wear yourself out. You still have to cook for your husband tonight, don't you? Yes, but that will be no problem. Josie stripped all 4 beds and made a pile of the sheets and blankets, planning to do all the laundry on Monday. If Lillian let her come back, that was. She was changing the older woman's house a great deal, and not everyone appreciated that kind of change. She found clean sheets and put them on the beds, also finding some clean bedding for the room she was certain was Lillian's. Taking the rest of the things, she carried them to the parlor and set them on the floor. If it's all right, I'd like to take home your bedding. It all needs to be washed, and I can do it with mine Monday morning. I'll come back Monday afternoon with everything and remake all the beds. Lillian nodded, her eyes wide. I wouldn't let just anyone take my things home with them, but since you're married to a Mountie and all. Lillian seemed genuinely shocked that someone would want to help her the way she was. Josie smiled. It makes me seem more like an upstanding citizen, doesn't it? Yes, it does at that. Lillian smiled. I appreciate all your help today. It's not a problem at all. I just need to make the dumplings and drop them into the pot, and you'll have enough food fixed for a few days as well. Is there anything other than that you need done before I come back on Monday afternoon? Lillian shook her head. Agatha got to her feet and followed Josie into the kitchen, watching her as she rolled out the dumplings. You're really going to keep coming back to help her? Well, of course I am. I told you I needed to keep busy, and I will have this house completely shipshape within a week. Then I can come a couple of afternoons a week to cook and make sure everything stays clean. It's a godsend to me, keeping me from getting bored and helping me stay out of mischief. Josie grinned at the older woman to let her know she didn't really get into mischief, but she was very pleased to be busy for a change. I don't think I've ever seen a young person do so much for a total stranger before. Lillian really doesn't have the money to pay anyone to help her. I'm not asking for pay. God has given me the strength to cook and clean that Lillian doesn't have. That makes it my duty to do all I can for her to keep her house up. I promise that I will be back on Monday and probably every afternoon next week. Once the windows are all washed and this house shines like it's new, I'll know my job here is done. And I'll start just coming 2 days per week instead of every day. Agatha smiled. That will help Lillian out a lot. Her children have all married and left the island, and she doesn't have a lot of friends. She's going to be very grateful to you. I'm happy to help when I can. Josie finished cutting up the dumplings and dropped them into the pot of chicken and broth. This needs to cook for about 45 minutes, and then it will be ready to eat. Wonderful. Agatha stood watching Josie as she walked toward the door, stopping to pick up the laundry. I'll be back on Monday, Miss Lillian. I'll see you then. Josie waited as Agatha held the door open for her, and she headed back to her house, putting the laundry into a pile just inside the back door of her cabin, where it would be out of the way. She started supper for Ernie, though she was certain he'd forget to come home again. As many times as he told her that he was busy, whenever he looked at her, he seemed surprised she was there. Ernie was practically perfect in every way, but sometimes he was downright infuriating. She would do her best to dwell on his positive points and not his negative. Ernie spent Saturday afternoon going over every note left by Timothy before his death. There seemed to be a file missing, and that's what confused him most. Before the other men went home on Saturday, he asked them one by one if they'd seen a file that Timothy was working on. No one had. Just as Aaron was leaving for the evening, he turned around and looked at Ernie. You know, you really should go home to your wife. She'd love to serve you supper that wasn't cold for a change. With those words, Aaron closed the door. Ernie shook his head. He'd forgotten again. Standing up, he pulled on his red serge jacket over the top of his shirt, and he walked to the general store. He needed to find a nice gift for his wife so she could forgive him. He didn't think she even knew that she should be angry, but he did. He was glad he'd found a wife that wouldn't be angry when he did things wrong, but it only made him angrier with himself. Looking around at the meager supplies there, he walked around, trying to make a decision. Finally, he spotted a small vase. When she'd brought supper to him the night before, she'd had a bouquet of flowers in a water glass. A vase would be so much prettier. He walked to the front of the store and paid for the vase, asking old Joe to wrap it up for him. It's a gift for my new bride. She sure is a beauty, Ernie. I don't know where you found her. She's pretty special, isn't she? I think she's the perfect wife for me. Ernie paid the man cash and took the wrapped vase. Thank you. He hurried out the door, determined to be home at a decent hour for the first time since he'd married her. When he walked in the door, he was a bit surprised over her appearance. The house was perfect as always, and the supper she was cooking smelled delicious. But her hair was hanging down from its usual bun, her dress covered in dust. What have you been doing all day? He asked. Well, I left the house after lunch so I could go see Elizabeth, and I met this older woman on the street. Josie left out the part about trying to bribe people to be her friend with cookies. He wouldn't approve, and he therefore didn't need to know about it. I told her I was looking for someone to help, and she happened to have this friend who is housebound. I went to see her, and there was so much to do. I cleaned her kitchen, made her supper, cleaned her parlor and dining room, and I even stripped her beds. I'll wash all of her bed linens on Monday with our laundry and take it all back on Monday afternoon. I figure I can have her house shipshape by Friday afternoon, and then she'll only need help a couple of afternoons a week, but in the meantime I'll have filled a whole week. Josie was ecstatic about her day, and it was obvious. You did all that just because you wanted something to do? He asked, surprised. He'd never met anyone remotely like his wife. She was definitely one of a kind. Well, sure, it's something I can do, which makes me happy, and it makes her house a better place to live, which makes her happy. Who was this woman you helped? Lillian. I never learned her last name. He nodded. I've met her a couple of times. She seems like a nice lady. He didn't tell her that the doctor had told him Lillian's illness was all in her mind. She missed her children, so she stopped leaving her house. People take food to her, but she has to cook it herself. Not today. I made her a huge pot of chicken and dumplings. She should be able to eat on it for a few days. He walked to her and kissed her softly, avoiding touching her anywhere that was covered with dirt, so that left her mouth. Thankfully she had washed her hands before she'd started cooking. I brought you a gift, but you might want to take a bath before you touch it. She laughed. When you clean up filth, you get dirty. It doesn't hurt anything. She went to the sink and washed her hands, splashing some water on her face to clean it a bit as well. I'll take a bath after supper. Will supper burn if you take a bath now? He asked. She shook her head. Am I really that bad? You are really that bad. Go get a bath. I'll give you your gift when you come out. Ernie sat down at the table and set her gift, wrapped in brown paper, in front of him. His wife was truly a marvel. A messy marvel at the moment, but a marvel no less. She had found a need in town, and she'd risen to that need. How could anyone be good enough for his Joss? Chapter 6. After her bath, Josie joined Ernie in the main room, and she sat down across from him. You said you brought me a gift? Josie hadn't received a gift since her mother's death. Her father had never thought of gifts, and she hadn't been one to ask for them. Receiving a gift made her feel like a little girl again. Ernie nodded to the brown paper-wrapped package on the table in front of him. Just something I realized we didn't have that I thought would make you happy. She carefully unwrapped the paper from the gift and smiled when she pulled out her present. It's a vase. I was planning to get one on Monday. He grinned. Now you don't have to. It's pretty, isn't it? It's beautiful. She set the vase down and hurried around the table to him, sitting in his lap and kissing him. Thank you for getting me something so special. You're the special one, Josie. I don't think you have any idea how special. No one else would do what you did for an elderly woman. Josie shrugged. I'll help anyone in need. I'm sure I'll be able to find someone else to help when I'm done with Lillian. She and Agatha sat and talked all day while I worked. You know you can't let the whole town treat you as an unpaid maid, don't you? She laughed. I don't feel like an unpaid maid. I feel more like a fairy godmother, hurrying around town and transforming things for people who can't make the transformations themselves. You are some woman, Josephine Keeler. She leaned down and kissed him once more. I'm so excited that you came home without me having to drag you here for a change. Are you hungry? Yes, I am hungry. He watched her as she jumped up and put supper on the table. Would you like to go for a walk after supper? She nodded happily. She was a little sore from all she'd done that day, but she knew she'd just stiffen up if she didn't keep on moving. Besides, it was a good sore, because it meant she'd accomplished a lot. That made her happy. As they walked, she noticed Rocky again. He went to someone's house and picked up something in his little hand. He turned it over and over before he climbed up the side of the house and ran off again. What do you think he's carrying? She asked. Ernie shrugged. Could be just about anything. Flying squirrels are notorious thieves. I didn't know that. I learned so much from you. His arm wrapped around her, and he hugged her close. I think a lot of you, Josie. I think a lot of you, too. She wondered if it was time that she could ask him about the murder investigation. He'd always brushed her off before, but maybe this time, he'd answer. Have you learned any more about what happened to Timothy? I don't want you worrying about that. You just keep doing your good deeds, and I'll keep doing my best to figure out who killed Tim. He stopped walking and pulled her to him, kissing her again. Kissing you under the stars is as wonderful as I imagined it would be. Josie smiled, not letting herself get upset because he wouldn't talk to her about his friend. Instead, she wrapped her arms around his neck. I don't know that I ever imagined kissing you under the stars before I met you, but it makes me feel good that you imagined kissing me. She stood on tiptoe and pressed herself against him, kissing him once more. Let's go home. There are fun things to do as newlyweds that just can't be done in the middle of the street. Even if it is after dark. He laughed. I like the way you think. Do you have to work tomorrow, or will you be able to go to church with me? She hoped he'd be attending church with her. She wanted him to introduce her around to all of the people she hadn't yet met. It's not my Sunday to work. I'll be at church. I need to introduce everyone to my beautiful new bride. It wouldn't be good if other men didn't know you were married and they tried to get to know you better. Are you jealous of imaginary men who haven't even met me yet? Ernie grinned. Maybe and maybe not. Let's just say, I feel the need for everyone to know you're mine. I like that. She'd never dreamed she would enjoy a man who was possessive of her, but Ernie was, and she thought the world of him. Josie was up as early as usual the following morning, fixing breakfast. She hadn't thought to ask what time church services were, so she decided to err on the side of caution. She had never heard of anyone going to church before 9 in the morning, so she had breakfast ready at 8. As soon as it was done, she walked to the bed and shook Ernie's shoulder. Breakfast is ready. He grabbed her shoulders and pulled her down into bed with him, kissing her softly. What time is it? It's 8. I figured we'd for sure be on time for church if we had breakfast at 8. She was glad she'd taken the time to wash her hair during her bath the night before, because now there was very little to do to get herself ready. She wondered if he attended church in his uniform or if he wore a suit like other men. Since church doesn't start until 10, we have plenty of time. Ernie held her close, not trying to do anything more, just happy to hold her. I'm glad we have a day off together. I prepared a picnic, she said. I thought we could take a walk after church and go wherever we wanted. That sounds lovely to me. We'll go right after church, and we won't stop until we see just the right place for our romantic picnic. He kissed her quickly before rolling out of bed. Now I need to eat my breakfast. Would you please stop distracting me from my goals? She shook her head as she scrambled out of the bed to pour coffee for both of them. Do you wear your uniform to church? He nodded. For any dress occasion. He raised an eyebrow at her. Why? Do you like my uniform? Show me a young Canadian lady who isn't obsessed with Mounties and their uniforms, and I will show you a liar. She sat down with him, and they prayed before eating their meal. So you do like my uniform? She laughed. I love the way your shoulders look in it. Red serge is definitely attractive. She loved how he looked in it, but she didn't want his head to get any more swelled about it than it already was. Glad to hear it. He forked up a bite of pancakes, smiling at her. I'll do my best to wear it more often for you. You're so good to me. After breakfast, he took a bath while she did the dishes and put the cabin to rights. Before he came back out of the tiny bathroom, the bed was made, and everything looked spotless. You are a very tidy woman. He had never seen anyone put so much effort into keeping a house perfect. I just like to be busy. I like to read, but I can only do that for so long before I start feeling as if I'm wasting my day. I like to go on walks exploring, but if I'm going alone, I feel like I should be doing something more constructive. It's a curse, I tell you. I'll do my best to start ripping my clothes, so you'll have something to mend. She laughed at that. If you could wait until I'm finished with Miss Lillian's house, I'd really appreciate it. Hopefully you'll find something equally exciting to do when you're done with her place. I'm sure I will. There's always something to do. If I have to, I'll start baking pies and selling them on the church lawn and donating all proceeds to the church. She shrugged. Maybe I could start a quilting circle, and we could sell off the quilts to help the church. I'm not sure if the church is that desperate in its need for funds right now. Oh, please. There's not a church in this country who isn't always needing more money. Let's be honest here. That's true. Ernie stroked her cheek with the back of one finger. You'll figure out how to stay busy, and I'm keeping my ears open for anyone in need of some help. I appreciate that. Josie gathered up the lunch she'd made and packed it into a picnic hamper, folding a quilt and putting it over the top. There. Now we're ready for our picnic after church. Should we carry this with us or pick it up on our way? I think we should pick it up on our way. If we take food you've cooked into church, with as good as it smells, I have a feeling everyone in church would be following us on our picnic. You'd be the Pied Piper of Bison Bay. I kind of like the imagery that gives me. She winked at him over her shoulder. We have 30 minutes before church starts. Is it too early to go? I'd like to meet as many people as I can. I'm going to be active in this community. You weren't in your community in Ottawa? Josie shook her head. I was too busy taking care of my father and his house. There was no time for me to be active. I'm sure when we start having children, I'll be too busy here, but for now, I need to be active or lose my mind. Ernie grinned, offering her his arm. Let's go to church so I can introduce you around then. I don't want my sweet wife to lose her mind. The walk to church was short, and she noticed there were many others on the street that morning, all of them walking toward the small chapel. She was pleased to see that so many people in town attended church. Are there many people in town? It's a good-sized town, he answered. Big enough that we have a school and a regular pastor. The community isn't as close-knit as some, but I think that will change as time passes. Why do you think it will change? It seems to me that every year cities grow more, and people focus more on what they're doing than on their neighbors. Soon people won't even know who lives next door to them, and that would be a shame. Josie had always wanted to have a friend who was her neighbor. At home, she'd had no friends, because she was always so busy. She'd made it to church on Sundays, and that was all. When they reached the church, a lady looked at Josie questioningly. I'm Josie. I'm Ernie's new wife. Where'd you come from? Ottawa. I've always wanted to live on an island, though. This is such a beautiful place. I'm Hilda. Hilda spoke with a slight German accent, and Josie couldn't help but wonder if the woman was an immigrant herself or if perhaps her parents had been immigrants. With Canada's rich history of cultures, there was really no telling without asking. It's so nice to meet you, Hilda. I know very few people in town, and I'm thrilled to make the acquaintance of everyone here. Hilda nodded, stepping into the church. My husband isn't going to be here today. He isn't feeling well. Do you have children? Hilda nodded. I have 6 children. 3 are still at home, and they seem to have whatever illness my Gustav has. My older 3 are all married and living in Charlottetown now. The allure of the big city has taken in all of my children so far. I hope at least one will stay here in Bison Bay. That would be really nice for you, Josie said. I hope to have a big family someday. I hope you get that wish, Hilda said. It was nice to meet you. The older woman headed to the other side of the church and sat down. Josie smiled at Ernie. Did I make a friend? I have no idea, but maybe. Ernie was amused by how excited she was at the prospect of making friends in her new home. She talked to every female in the entire church before the sermon started. She even smiled and waved at the pastor. He was amazed at just how gregarious his new bride was. After the service, she talked to as many as she could again, happy to get to know some of the people better. The only one of her fellow brides that was there was Elizabeth, and she realized that must mean that Catherine was still sick, with Nettie watching over her. She felt a pang as she thought about Nettie, wondering what the other girl would do now that her Mountie had died. Hopefully there would be a way to get her back home to Ottawa, to become a bride to a different Mountie or find her a man right there in Bison Bay. They were the last people to leave the church other than the pastor, and Josie spoke to the pastor before they left. I want you to know that if there are any projects that are needed, I'm happy to volunteer my time. What kind of projects? The pastor asked. Oh, like a bake sale or a quilting circle to make quilts to sell, or if you know of anyone who is housebound who needs help cooking or cleaning. I'm happy to do just about everything. Ernie just isn't messy enough to keep me busy. Josie shook her head at her new husband, who just grinned in return. Well, I'll see what I hear of then. I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Keeler. Thank you, Pastor. Josie took Ernie's arm and left the church, all but skipping with joy. He might find something for me to do. I think I made some new friends today, and we're going on a picnic. I don't think I've ever met anyone who finds such joy in the simple things in life, he told her. I envy that. why envy it? You can choose to find joy in simple things too. Ernie sighed. I find joy in you. It's going to take me time to find true joy in the rest of life. I have business to take care of first. Josie knew exactly what Ernie was saying, and she even understood. She wanted to explain that she'd just learned how to find the good in everything around her, but she wasn't sure how that would go over. Instead, she clung to his arm and provided the silent support she hoped would help him. They retrieved the picnic basket, and Ernie carried it as they walked out of town. Should we take a buggy? She asked. I don't own a buggy. I'm just as happy to walk anyway. It's nice to go on long rambling walks on days when I don't need to be cooped up in the office. Ernie realized then that part of his problem was that he hadn't had a turn doing rounds since Timothy died. He was used to riding out in every direction at least 3 days per week. He promised himself he'd make sure that happened at least one day of the following week. I don't need a buggy. She looked to the south, where she knew the ocean was. Every time they walked, they seemed to head east, and she really wanted to see the ocean from their own bay. Do you ever picnic along the shore? He smiled, looking over at her. Of course she'd want to go to the shore. You're new to town, and it's not just part of the landscape yet. He abruptly turned and headed toward the south. Yes, let's picnic on the shore. Oh, thank you, Ernie, you are really the best husband I could imagine for myself. At her words, Ernie felt guilt stab through him. He'd married her Wednesday and promptly forgotten she existed on Thursday. Yet she still seemed to see the best in him. He was impressed at the kind of woman he'd married and wondered if he could ever live up to her expectations of him. When they reached the shore, she clapped her hands together, looking out across the bay. The ocean is so beautiful. He smiled. It's also deadly, so don't just up and decide you want to go for a swim. Make sure you are always safe. All right. She couldn't imagine anything that beautiful could be as deadly as he said, but she wouldn't argue with him. The first rule of being a good wife was not arguing with your husband. She hoped she would never have to break that rule, but she could see a time in the future when it might be necessary. She was a strong-willed lady, and she would never again live under a man's thumb. She spread her quilt out on a flat area of the shore and unpacked the picnic basket. This is the most beautiful place for a picnic. I'm so thankful to you for bringing me here. He sank onto the quilt opposite her, shaking his head. I feel like a heel for not bringing you here before. I should have known that someone new to the area would be wanting to see the shore. You know, I saw it from the ferry. I did see the shore, but I didn't see our shore. I like our shore best. He grinned at her, taking her hand in his. Next time you want to do something like this, just tell me. I won't always understand hints. I'm a man after all, and men just don't think that way. Instead of telling him that men should think that way like she wanted, she simply smiled at him. One of these days she was going to forget to bite her tongue, and he was going to be very surprised by what came out of her mouth. Chapter 7. Josie enjoyed Ernie's day off a great deal, and she wished they could have had a honeymoon so they would have had more time together. Getting to know her new husband had become one of her greatest joys. Tell me more about your brother, she said as she was cleaning up their picnic remains. Bert? He's a good guy. More straight-laced than I am. I'm a great deal more fun-loving. I love my brother, but he makes me feel like I'm lacking when I choose to go to a dance and not stay home and study. He always overshadowed me. But you love him? She asked. I love him more than I can express. We're connected, and we write to each other regularly. His new wife is making his life worth living, according to what he's written me. That's what made me decide to send for a mail order bride. He's so happy with his that I had to give it a try. Ernie reached out and stroked her cheek. Have I told you yet how happy I am that Miss Hazel sent you? Josie smiled. I am, too. I can't imagine what my life would be like with one of the other Mounties, but with you, I feel like my life is going just the way I want it to. Are you going to write your father about where you ended up? Ernie asked. He hated that she'd had a falling out with her father that had resulted in her leaving the city, and he hoped they'd be able to find a way to mend fences. I don't know. I was really hurt when they kicked me out. He never really showed any appreciation for what I did, and let me tell you, I did a lot. She sighed. I probably need to write him a letter so he knows where I am. I think it will be good for me as well as for him. She dreaded doing it, but she knew it was the right thing to do. What about his new wife? She shuddered. Mrs. Melton gets nothing from me. I'm happy to say I will never have to see that woman again. I'm sure she's already talked my father into hiring a housekeeper because she'll think it's too much work for just one person. I was always surprised she didn't want me to stay on as an unpaid maid. Would you have done it? He asked, studying her. I probably would have. I had no sense of how much I was working for my father. I just thought it was what I was supposed to do. When I explained all my duties to Miss Hazel, she was very angry. She wanted to walk over to my house and talk to my father, but I told her no. I'd never protested what I was doing. I never had a problem with any of it. It was my life, and I didn't mind. Though she now realized she should have protested, she wasn't sure if she would if she could go back and do it again. She'd truly enjoyed the work. Please know that I don't think of you as someone who has to cook and clean for me. I mean, I'm glad you do, but it's you I care about. Not the work you do. She smiled at that. Thank you, you're welcome. He stood up and reached down a hand for her, pulling her to her feet. She folded the quilt and hung it over the picnic basket, allowing him to take it from her. Are we going to keep walking? Or go home? Let's walk, if you don't mind. I do my best thinking while I walk. Does that mean I should be quiet while you think, or may I continue to jabber away about whatever sparks my mind? He laughed. You may jabber away all you like. I happen to like to listen to you talk. You do? She asked. She was surprised. Her father had always told her that she made him crazy by talking on and on. She had no one else to talk to for the most part, so of course she talked on and on. If she'd had other people in her life, it would have been easier for both of them. She pointed out different wildlife as they walked, getting excited when she saw some birds building a nest. I love the spring. It always feels like the earth is waking up after a long nap, and it just feels so good to be out in it. You were allowed to leave your house back in Ottawa, weren't you? Ernie suddenly worried that she'd been almost a prisoner in her home. Oh, yes, of course. I was allowed to go to church on Sundays and run all of my father's errands. I went to the bank every Monday, and I did food shopping on Mondays and Thursdays. My life was very regimented, but I could leave. And we had a lovely back garden, and I would go out there and work with the plants. It brought me peace. Work with the plants? As far as Ernie could tell, she had been her father's housekeeper, cook, maid, laundress, and now gardener? He just wanted to meet the man so he could hurt him. Oh, yes. I love plants. I love to weed and prune. I would neglect my other chores in the spring so I could play with the flowers. Neglecting for her meant she only did the job expected of her instead of going above and beyond all the time. Do you ever think that your father may have overworked you? He asked, wondering if he was stirring up a hornet's nest. She laughed. I'm sure other people would see it that way, but I truly loved all of it. I felt busy and, well, I felt needed. Like someone really and truly had to have me around to help them. It made me happy. He frowned. Is that what you're trying to do now? Feel needed? She shrugged. Maybe. A lot of it really is that I don't like idle time. I enjoy reading, but I feel so guilty after taking the time to do it. I think I should be busy doing things for the good of others, not just reading for my own entertainment. You could take up a hobby like drawing or painting. You could do some needlework. I don't know. I'll think about it. For now, I'm going to finish up Miss Lillian's house, because she needs the help. You know there's nothing wrong with Miss Lillian, don't you? Ernie asked softly. He had no idea how she'd feel when she found out the truth about her new friend. I had a feeling that was the case, but it's okay. Even if there is nothing wrong with her, there is something that's preventing her from doing what needs to be done in her home. I don't know that she'd eat without help from others. I'm happy to make her a home, a place where people can visit and feel comfortable. You're an amazing woman, Josie. She looked at him with surprise. Why do you say that? Most people who are active and work hard have a problem with people who don't or can't. They think of them as lazy. Instead of feeling that way about her, you jump in and help her even though there's not a thing wrong with her. See, that's where I think you're wrong. I think there must be something wrong inside her head if she is content to live in that kind of filth and she doesn't do anything about it. Does that make sense? Ernie nodded. I think it does. So even though the doctor says there's nothing wrong, you can see a need, and you're going to take care of it. That's exactly right. She was thrilled he understood her. Would it help you if I brought you a lunch to the jail every day? He shook his head. I thank you for the offer, but I do just fine going to the cafe for lunch. I like to see the people there. It helps me monitor the town. He paused his walking and turned to her. Besides, I'm not going to add to my wife's workload. She grinned. You know, when I start having babies, I probably won't be constantly looking for something to do to fill up my days. I hope not. I've heard children keep you awfully busy. And maybe when we have children, you'll remember to come home at night. He sighed. I'm going to do my very best. I promise. By the time they got home from their walk, it was time for Josie to start supper, which she immediately did. Ernie sat in one of their chairs, watching everything she did. I still love watching you move around the kitchen. She wrinkled her nose at him. That's a little bit strange there, Ernie. I never said I wasn't a little strange. He ran his fingers through his black hair that had a tendency to stick up all over his head. I hope you know how much I appreciate all you do for me. But more than that, I appreciate you. She smiled at him. Well, thank you. Those words are very nice to hear. He knew that he'd always liked hearing them from the people who lived in his district. He worked hard, and being told it was noticed made a difference in his attitude. While they were sitting and having supper, there was a knock at the door, and he stood up, walking over and opening it. Mr. Dilly. Can I help you? I hope so. The man looked around him at Josie. I'm sorry to interrupt your supper. There were some strange noises coming from the feed store, and I was afraid to go in and look. I'm afraid there might be a thief in there, trying to take all of the money. Ernie smiled at Josie. I'll be back as soon as I can. He grabbed his hat, patted his holster to be sure he was wearing his gun, and disappeared out the door. Josie finished her supper alone, praying for Ernie almost constantly. Why hadn't she considered that he was putting his life on the line so often? Being married to a Mountie was a lot harder than she'd thought it would be. As soon as she thought about his life being on the line, she changed her thinking. He was doing good for others. He was a wonderful man who always put others first. No, she wouldn't dwell on anything negative. It was against her entire outlook on life. When Ernie came back 30 minutes later, he grinned. One of the town's stray dogs got into his store and was making noise in there. I chased him out, and now we have peace again in Bison Bay. Except for the murderer still on the loose. She saw by his face what he was thinking about, but she said nothing about the murderer. I'm just glad you're safe. My big brave Mountie scared the dog away and saved the day. Ernie laughed. I'm not sure about saving the day. He should have been smart enough to know that a human wouldn't be making those howling sounds, but he was scared and confused. Are you called out for things like that often? Quite often, he said with a smile. I don't mind. I didn't want to leave you, but the task took almost no time. He reached out and took another scoop of mashed potatoes and plopped them on his plate. The good thing about your cooking is that it's still good cold. So even when I'm interrupted for silly things, I can look forward to coming home and enjoying my meal when I finish up. Josie smiled at him. Would you like some more water? I would love some more water. He watched her move with a smile on his face. His wife was a beautiful woman. She brought him back a fresh glass of water. What is that big smile on your face about? I was just thinking about what a beautiful, loving, giving wife I have. I am the luckiest man in all of Canada. Only Canada? She asked with a pout. He laughed, catching her hand as she resumed her seat. I'm the luckiest man in the whole world. Is that better? She nodded. Yes, much better. She grinned at him. I think I'm pretty lucky, too. If only he would start coming home at a decent hour, she knew she would be thrilled with him. She was already half in love as it was. After the dishes were done, they sat together, just talking. She asked him about several of the women she'd met at church that morning and asked if there was anyone she should steer clear of in town. He would know everyone much better than she did. Not really. There are some odd people in town, but most of them seem to be good-hearted. I'm sure you won't run into any trouble if you're trying to help people. And then the idea that there was a murderer in town flashed through his mind. A woman could kill as well as a man could, couldn't she? Was he right in letting her have the run of the town while he worked? Just be careful. I'm always careful, she said with a grin. She wasn't, of course. She hated having to watch over her shoulder. What are your plans for tomorrow? He asked, wanting to know where she was headed so he could follow her trail if necessary. I'm going to bake bread for us and Miss Lillian and do our laundry and all of her bedding. I'll probably head to her house around noon so I can clean some more and make her something to eat for supper, even though you know there's not a thing wrong with her. He still marveled that she could be so giving. It will keep me busy and make her life better. Sounds like a good situation on both of our ends. He took her hand and brought it to his lips. You amaze and humble me. I'm glad we had this day together. It would have been nice if we could have taken a whole week for a honeymoon, but I'm glad we had a day. It was delightful. The day had been so much better than she'd imagined. A quiet day with Ernie was better than the most exciting day without him. He grinned. We'll have another delightful Sunday next week. Do you ever have Saturdays off? She asked softly. I will have them off again after we solve this murder. I feel like it has to be my whole focus right now, because we need to bring whoever did it to justice. We owe Timothy that. I can see that. And she could, but she still wished she had a little more time with her husband. Do you want me to plan to bring supper to the jail tomorrow night? He shook his head. No, I'll be home at 6. He'd told all 3 of his men to remind him to go home for supper at 6. Hopefully at least one of them would remember. He couldn't keep being that late for supper. He had a wife now, and he needed to remember that even when he was working. All right, she said skeptically. If you're not home by 6:15, I'm going to head down to the jail and ask you to come home again. You won't have to. He promised himself that he wouldn't do that to her again. She'd been extremely patient with him, not even getting angry. He didn't deserve a woman who was so good to him. Are you going to plant a garden here? I would love to. I hadn't even really considered it. Would you mind? Of course not. I'd be thrilled with a flower garden, but a kitchen garden would be more useful. Whichever you'd prefer to do, you should do. She grinned at him. Trying to keep me out of trouble still? Well, maybe. She laughed, moving over to sit on his lap. I'm glad you worry about me. You don't need to, though. I have a long history of staying out of trouble. I'm so glad to hear it. I still think a garden would be nice. It would keep her occupied, and she started thinking about what she would plant. A variety of vegetables and flowers would be nice, and maybe he could build a bench to sit at the edge of the garden, and she could look out over her flowers. She loved the idea, and she kissed him to tell him so. Chapter 8. Josie spent the next day doing exactly what she'd set out to do. She got all of her and Ernie's laundry done along with the bedding from Miss Lillian's house. While the clothes were on the line, she baked 4 loaves of bread, planning to take one to Miss Lillian. Fresh bread was a real treat to people who didn't have the ability to bake it for themselves. After she'd had lunch, she brought in the clothes and folded them, putting Miss Lillian's in a separate basket. Then she wrapped a loaf of bread in a towel, and she carried it all over to the older woman's house. She knocked and waited a moment before turning the doorknob, calling out, "Miss Lillian, it's Josie. I brought your laundry back." When Josie got into the house, she saw that Miss Lillian was back in her favorite spot in the parlor, with her feet up. She was sitting quietly, staring off into space. When she saw Josie, she frowned. "You came back. I told you I would. I brought your laundry, and I brought you a fresh loaf of bread. Have you had lunch yet?" Josie realized that Miss Lillian was very thin and pale. She hoped she was eating enough. "I haven't eaten yet today. Let me fix you a plate and bring it to you then." Josie frowned when she saw there was a small mess in the kitchen, but she knew she could have it cleaned in a fraction of the time it had taken her on Saturday. She quickly found some ham steaks and fried them, taking Miss Lillian a sandwich. "Now what would you like me to start on first, or should I just keep doing whatever I see?" "Whatever you'd like to do is fine," Miss Lillian told her. "I'm just happy for the help and the company." 3 hours later, Josie had cleaned all the bedrooms and remade each bed. She would start on the windows when she came back the next day. "I'm finished for the day," she said, going into the parlor and sitting beside Miss Lillian. "I have the bread wrapped on your counter, and I fried another ham steak for you, so that's ready for your supper." "Thank you." "You're very welcome. I'll be back tomorrow to do a little more. We'll have your house set to rights in no time." Josie got to her feet. "Do you want to eat the sandwich for supper, or should I bring over some of the supper I'm making for my husband?" Miss Lillian frowned. "What are you making?" Josie held back a laugh. "I'm going to make scalloped potatoes and ham with a side of green beans. I'd be happy to bring you some." Miss Lillian nodded. "That would make me very happy. Are you sure you don't mind?" Josie knew that asking if she minded was just an afterthought. Miss Lillian really wanted the meal she was fixing. "All right. My husband comes home at 6, so I'll bring it by around 5:45. Does that work for you?" "That would be lovely." As Josie disappeared out the door, she thought that Miss Lillian looked rather like a queen sitting on her throne. That probably made Josie a lady-in-waiting, but she didn't mind. She was being useful. Ernie got home from work a little early that evening, having been reminded by all three of his men it was time to go home to his wife. They seemed to understand that he just couldn't keep it in his head that he was married, so they prompted him to help him out. When he arrived home, Josie was nowhere to be seen. Supper was on the stove with a big portion taken out of it, but there was no wife. He frowned and wondered if he was later than he'd realized, and maybe she'd eaten without him. He hoped not, because he'd truly tried to be there on time. He washed his hands, and then took his spot at the table, growing slowly angry. He'd made a real effort to be home on time, and she wasn't even there. What was she thinking? In the matter of a minute, his anger switched to worry. There was still a murderer running around loose in Bison Bay. What if she was a victim? The door opened, and he got to his feet, running to his wife and embracing her. "I was so worried." "You're 5 minutes early." "I was only gone for 15 minutes. She sighed. "Are we never going to be able to be ready for supper at the same time?" "Where were you?" he asked, his anger coming back a little. She should have let him know where she was going. "I promised Miss Lillian I'd take her some supper. She was tired of sandwiches, and then when I got there, she wanted to talk for a few minutes about her children. So we talked." Miss Lillian needed company more than she needed someone cleaning her home for her. Ernie shook his head. "It sounds like you're putting her needs above mine." "Of course I'm not. I took her a meal at 5:45, so I could be home for you at 6. That's not putting her needs first." Josie couldn't even believe he was quibbling with her about time. He had no right with as late as he was half the time. "When I get home after a hard day of work, I would like my wife at home and my supper on the table," he said, his hands on his hips. "Your supper is ready. Just a moment, and I'll dish it up." Josie walked to the stove and closed her eyes, counting to 10 before she put supper on the table. He had her furious. How could he even think it was a little bit acceptable for him to complain about what time she got home? He'd been late the first 2 nights of their marriage. By the time she turned back toward him, she had a smile on her face again. She was sure it looked forced, but it was a smile. Would you like water or milk to drink? Milk would be nice. Ernie watched as she cut several pieces of bread off a fresh loaf before she poured their drinks and sat at the table with him. Let's pray. In his prayer, he made sure to mention that they both needed to stop worrying the other by being late. Josie ate her meal in mostly silence. Ernie talked a bit about funny things that he'd heard had happened around town, but she just nodded. Finally, when the meal was almost over, Ernie looked at her. Are you upset about something? Josie took a deep breath, knowing she had to be honest with him, but not wanting to start a fight. She would not argue with her husband. It didn't need to happen. Just a little, she answered softly. Why? Did something happen today? Ernie asked, obviously truly clueless about what had upset her. Well, the first 2 nights we were married, you only came home from work because I went to the Mountie office to fetch you. You're home on time tonight, and I'm thrilled that you are, but you got angry with me for not being here before you. I was here by 6, when you were supposed to come home. I guess I don't feel like you really have any right to complain after being so late the first 2 nights. Ernie studied her for a moment and nodded. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me for being late, or will that be thrown in my face with every argument we have from now until we're old and gray? I've already forgiven you for it. I just didn't think you needed to complain to me for doing something lesser than what you'd done. Josie stood up and took her plate to the kitchen, pouring the hot water she'd been heating into the sink. The man needed to be shot, and if he wasn't careful, she'd teach herself to shoot just so she could do it. Ernie couldn't believe how unreasonable his sweet wife was being. She'd not shown him this side of herself yet, and he really didn't like it. How dare she complain when he worked late? He'd been working. She was simply off delivering a meal to a woman who thought she was a recluse, but there was nothing wrong with her. Instead of fighting with her, he went into the bathroom and washed his face, trying his best to calm down. Sometimes women could be very unreasonable creatures. He stayed in there for a few minutes before coming out. Do you want to go for a walk? He asked. Josie nodded. She didn't want to be around him, but she looked forward to their walks all day. Of course she wasn't going to turn him down just because she wanted to be stubborn. She finished the last of the dishes and put them away, taking off her apron and hanging it on a hook. I'm ready. This time when they walked, he walked to the west instead of the east, which surprised her. We're going the other way, she said. He shrugged. I didn't want to start doing the same thing every night and bore you. Ernie, I have a feeling that life with you will be anything but boring. She allowed him to take her hand, though for a moment she considered snatching it away. She had more work to do on her temper, she could see. I hope you never find me boring. Ernie loved walking hand in hand with his little wife, who thought she could fix the world single-handedly. Did you get everything you wanted to do done at Lillian's today? She nodded. I did. I still need to wash all the windows and clean her kitchen again, but I think things are getting easier and easier every time. I did the worst of it all on Saturday. I'm glad it wasn't as hard today. You seemed very tired on Saturday evening. I like being tired from hard work. I consider that a good tired. If I am tired from sitting around all day, I don't like that nearly as well. Josie wished he could understand her mindset where work was concerned. When it was a work you enjoyed, it was just like having a hobby. As they left the town by the main road going the other way, she saw some lights off in the distance. Do people use the harbor at this time of night? She asked. Ernie frowned in the direction of the water. Not usually, but it's probably just a fisherman. Ernie finally stopped walking under a tall tree about half a mile out of town. There's a full moon tonight. Josie looked up at the moon. So there is. I just always wanted to kiss my bride under a full moon. The next thing I know, you're going to be dragging me to the schoolyard because you always wanted to kiss your bride there. Or you'll drag me to the jail for the same reason. I'm starting to worry about all of your fantasies about places you wanted to kiss your bride. He laughed. You found me out. I just like to kiss you, and I'll search for any excuse. Josie stepped closer to him and wrapped her arms around his neck. You don't have to look for excuses to kiss me, I'm always willing. Ernie pulled her closer and leaned down to kiss her, knowing she wasn't telling him the full truth. Earlier, she would not have let him kiss her while she was angry. Obviously, she was over the anger, and that pleased him. You're an awfully special wife, Josie. She smiled at him. She didn't feel particularly special after the way he'd gotten angry with her earlier, but she didn't say that. Starting another fight with him was the last thing she wanted to do. You're the special one. What are your plans for tomorrow? He wished he could get over his fears for her safety, but he wasn't sure if it was even possible. I'm going to clean the cabin in the morning, make sure everything is shiny, and then I'll go over to Miss Lillian's. I should be able to finish up her kitchen and wash all the windows tomorrow, and then she'll only need me a couple of afternoons a week to keep her caught up. I think she needs your company more than she needs you to cook and clean for her. She gets both. Josie knew he was right, but sitting and talking for hours on end wasn't part of her nature. She could only hope that more people would visit with as clean as she was making the older woman's house. Maybe it was a silly hope, but it was all she had to cling to. She decided she would also do some baking in the morning. She was sure Ernie would love to have her deliver some sweets to him and all his men. Just after noon the following day, Josie took a basket of cookies and scones to the jail, wondering if she would be allowed to learn more about the murder investigation if she had a legitimate reason to be there during the day. She opened the door to the jail to find just Aaron and Ernie in the office, both of them looking at something on Ernie's desk. Hello, gentlemen. I thought you might want some cookies and scones. She held up the basket. Ernie immediately turned the paper on his desk over and walked around to kiss her forehead. You made us sweets? I did. I was thinking of you and your coworkers this morning, and I thought it might be nice to have someone bring you something to show appreciation for all the hard work you do. She tried to see what the paper was that he'd turned over, but she couldn't tell from there. Thank you, Josie, Aaron said softly. Elizabeth says good things about you. I think a lot of her, too. Josie was tempted to ask him what was wrong with his marriage, that his wife was afraid to talk about it, but she bit her tongue. She knew it would be rude, and there was no reason for that at all. Ernie and Aaron both took some of the cookies and scones, setting them aside. We promise to share with the others when they come back. All right. I should get to Miss Lillian's house then. She didn't tell Ernie that she had a lunch for Miss Lillian in her basket. For some reason, her going to the older woman's house had become a sore spot between them, and she wasn't going to be the one to rub lemon juice on it. Ernie nodded. Be careful. I'm always careful, she said with a grin, disappearing out the door. She hadn't been able to tell what was on the paper they'd been studying together, but she'd figure it out. Eventually. The first thing Josie did when she got to Miss Lillian's house was heat up her lunch and serve it to her, and then she rolled up her sleeves and started on the kitchen. For someone who rarely cooked for herself, Miss Lillian's kitchen was always a disaster. By the time she finished the kitchen, made the bed, and got all the windows clean, it was time for her to go. She walked into the parlor and sat down beside the older woman. I finished all I set out to do today. Your house looks good. Would you like me to bring you supper again tonight? What are you having? I put a pot roast in the oven before I left the house. I'm serving it with carrots, potatoes, and fresh bread. Josie grinned as the other woman seemed excited at the food. I would love a plate then. I'm going to bring it at 5:30 tonight instead of 6. My husband prefers if I'm home when he gets there. Josie got to her feet and hurried off to her house, quickly taking care of the last-minute preparations for their meal. She made a cake as well, planning to take a piece to the sweet old recluse. Just as she was leaving to take Miss Lillian's supper to her, there was a knock on her door. Elizabeth. I'm taking supper to Miss Lillian. Would you like to walk with me? Elizabeth nodded. I haven't seen you since church on Sunday, so I wanted to come and check on you. Well, I've been finishing up Miss Lillian's house, but now that it's done, I'll be looking for something else to do. You'll probably see me at your house tomorrow afternoon. I've missed my friend. The chores were so easy when I knew you'd be there every afternoon. Now that you've stopped coming, I feel like I'm pulling teeth trying to finish up everything I need to do. I haven't stopped coming, Josie protested. I just took a break to help someone. I'll be there tomorrow. Good. Elizabeth walked off with a quick wave, and Josie frowned after her. There were so many mysteries in this town, and she was not equipped to solve them all. Hopefully she would figure out at least a few. Chapter 9. Josie made sure she had supper on the table a few minutes before 6 that evening, knowing it would make Ernie happy. Then she waited. And waited. At 6:30, she walked down to the jail, ready to pull Ernie home by his ear if that's what it took. The man had a clock in his office, and he should be able to come home and eat at a decent hour. When she got to the jail, he was inside talking to someone, and she waited for a moment before opening the door. I'm sorry to interrupt. Ernie glanced at her with a frown, and then his eyes widened. He'd forgotten her again. Mr. Stillworth came by to talk to me about something strange he's seen in town. I got involved. That's all right. I just wanted to let you know I'm waiting for you. She had her hand on the door to leave when Ernie stopped her. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She nodded, planning to go home and reheat everything. Being his wife was becoming a little more difficult every day. It had been obvious the two men had just been talking and laughing when she'd arrived, and she knew Ernie had tried to cover up the fact he'd forgotten her again. He had to stop doing that. She got home and reheated all of the food, wanting his supper to be the best it could be for him. By the time he walked in the door 20 minutes later, she was furious but determined not to let it show. In the short while they'd been married, he'd been home late 3 times. There was something very wrong with the situation, and she was going to find out what it was, as soon as she calmed down. If she tried to talk to him about how she felt right away, she was going to blow up in his face, which wouldn't be good for either of them. He came in and washed his hands, taking her arm and pulling her to him for a kiss. The look she gave him stopped him short. I'm sorry, Josie. His words were soft, but he meant them from the very depths of his heart. He hoped she could see that and would understand. She nodded and sat down at the table, waiting for him to sit. When he prayed, he didn't try to hold her hand for the first time since they'd married, just under a week before. She served both of them and steadily ate her food, not talking. There was nothing to say unless she started yelling. Mr. Stillworth came to talk to me about Mountie business, Ernie said. After a few minutes, we switched and just started joking around with each other. I lost track of time. I should have been home when I promised, but I wasn't, and all I can do is apologize and try to do better in the future. Josie's worst fault, at least in her eyes, was that she was an angry crier. Anytime she was so furious she just wanted to hit someone, the tears started, and that night was no exception. She kept her head down because she didn't want him to see her tears and think she was sad. No, she wanted him to know she was furious. Ernie watched Josie, seeing tears falling down her cheeks and feeling like the biggest heel alive. How could he have hurt the woman who meant more to him than any other? He couldn't always remember to come home for supper on time. And he didn't even always remember her name. But he did always remember that he loved her. Josie, please don't cry. I didn't mean to upset you. Josie looked up at him then, and he could see the fire in her eyes. I'm not upset. I'm furious. I'm as angry as I have ever been in my entire life, so you need to just back off for a minute or two. I don't want to have to start yelling and screaming, and I'm this close. She held up her thumb and forefinger just a quarter inch apart, so he'd know she wasn't playing games with him. He bit his lip, finishing his supper with no words. He thought that would be best with as angry as she was. When she finished eating, she took his plate from him, not caring if he was finished eating or not, and carried it to the counter. She quickly cleared the entire table and began washing the dishes. Normally Ernie would sit and watch her work, but that night he knew better. Instead, he went over and found an old newspaper to hold in front of his face. He'd say he was reading it, but truly he had no idea what it said. He was hiding from his wife, plain and simple. He had never seen a woman quite as mad as his Josie was, and if the truth were told, he was very nervous about what she would say and do. Josie finished the dishes and stomped off into the bathroom, washing her face quickly. She didn't want the traces of tears left for him to see. Oh, how she hated being an angry crier. When she felt she had pulled herself together enough to be in the same room with Ernie again, she walked out into the main room of the house. She didn't look at him, though, because she wasn't certain she could do it without just exploding at him. "I'm walking down to Miss Lillian's to get the dirty dishes from the supper I took her. I want them washed, not sitting on her counter, waiting for me to come back." "I'll walk with you. I don't want you out alone at this time of night. It's 8. The monsters don't come out until later." She walked out the door, letting it close behind her, but she heard it open again as soon as she was out. "I'd rather you didn't walk with me." "I'd rather I did." He said nothing else as he fell into step beside her, determined to keep her safe. When she got to Miss Lillian's house, she knocked and slowly opened the door. Just as she expected, Miss Lillian was sitting in her parlor in the same position she was always in, her feet propped up in front of her. "I came to get my dishes, Miss Lillian." "Oh, yes, of course. Please take them with you." The older woman suddenly smiled. "I see you brought your big, strong Mountie with you. It's nice to see you, Constable Keeler." Ernie didn't bother to correct her on his rank. Most people in town didn't realize that he'd been promoted yet. "It's good to see you as well, Miss Lillian. My wife has been enjoying her time helping you out." "Enjoying? Don't you think that language is just a little strong, considering the backbreaking work she's been doing?" Josie stepped into the room and smiled at the woman. "I do enjoy my time here, Miss Lillian. It's nice not to feel as if I'm wasting time. When I work here, I can see exactly what I've done." "Well, you know I appreciate all the help you give me." Miss Lillian smiled and picked up a scone. "I'm still eating the cookies and scones you shared with me earlier." "I'm glad. I'll see you in a couple of days, Miss Lillian. I probably won't be back until Thursday." "You'll do all right on your own tomorrow, won't you?" "I will." Miss Lillian looked sad to not be getting her visitor the next day, but she seemed to understand. "Thank you, Josie. Good night." As Josie and Ernie left her home, Josie closed the door behind them, her dishes held in her other arm. She walked home as quickly as she could, not wanting to spend another minute in her husband's company than absolutely necessary. "Josie. Please talk to me." Ernie couldn't bear the silence for another minute. If she yelled at him, then it was no more than he deserved. Instead of responding, she walked into the house and washed the few dishes she'd gotten from Miss Lillian's house. Ernie walked over to her and stood beside her. "I'm so sorry." Josie closed her eyes and counted to 10, but suddenly it wasn't enough. She turned on him, wanting to kick him more than anything. "You should be sorry. The first 2 days we were married, you were late coming home. You finally showed up on time 2 days in a row, one of them berating me for not being early. And tonight, you're late again. I have to mean more to you than your work. I understand you were a Mountie first, and I understand your duties there come first. But you have to remember to come home. Or send a message, and you can't yell at me for not being home just because I wasn't here when you walked in the door. I may not be one of the people you're paid to protect, but I am your wife, and that makes me someone who has to be important to you." Ernie stood looking at her, waiting to see if she was finished, before responding. "I was wrong last night, Josie. I should never have gotten angry with you for not being here when I came home. And tonight. Well, I should have paid attention to the time and come home when I was expected, not made you come looking for me again. Forgive me?" Josie sighed. She didn't want to forgive him. She wanted to stay angry and tell him to sleep in the bathtub. She wanted to. She wanted to spit at him. She'd never spit at anyone in her life. "I don't want to forgive you," she finally said. "I will, because I want there to be peace in our household, but I need you to be kind to me. To think of me when you're off doing other things." "I will. I promise." He stepped closer to her and wrapped his arms around her, and she stayed rigid for only a moment before he could feel her melting against him. "I'm so sorry I've made your life difficult. I want us to be happy together." For a moment, he thought she should have married his perfect brother Bert, because Bert would have made her happy, but he could see her growing bored with his brother. No, she needed to be married to him, but he needed to be the best person he could be for her. Josie rested her head on his shoulder. "Please stop doing this to me." "I will. I swear I will." Ernie didn't try to kiss her, or do any more than simply hold her. He ran his hands up and down her back, trying to let her know that he really was sorry, and cared for her a great deal. Josie said nothing, not believing he was going to do the right thing, because his pattern had shown that he wouldn't. Maybe someday he'd figure out that she went a little crazy every time he forgot to come home, but she would be old and gray before that happened. The man knew how to make her angrier than any human being ever had, including Mrs. Melton. As she stood there with her head on Ernie's shoulder, she made the decision to write to her father and let him know she was married and living on PEI. He had a right to know, and she wanted to mend the fences between them. Everyone else felt her father had overworked her, but she knew the truth. He'd never asked her to do anything she hadn't wanted to do. Josie spent most of the following day at home. She baked bread, cleaned the house, and then she wrote the letter to her father. She worked for a little while, and then she threw what she'd done away and started over. She didn't want to sound like she was accusing him of something, because she truly wasn't. The only things her father had done wrong in her mind were marrying Mrs. Melton and not showing her any gratitude for the years she had done all of the housework and planned his parties. People had said she was a virtual slave, but she had never felt that way. Enjoying her work made all the difference in the world for her. It was after 2 in the afternoon when she ventured out of the house and wandered to the general store to mail her letter to her father. Old Joe was behind the counter as usual, and he was putting mail into the slots of the different people in town. "I have a letter I'd like to mail." Old Joe turned around and smiled at her. "Sounds good to me. I keep hearing such nice things about you, Mrs. Keeler." "Well, thank you for that," Josie said with a bit of a smile. "I always like to hear that when people talk about me, they say nice things, and not bad." He laughed softly. "I think this whole town is glad to have you here." "I hope so." She turned and hurried out of the store on her way to Elizabeth's house. It had been several days since they'd sat down to spend time together, and Josie hoped her friend was ready to talk now. When she got to Elizabeth's, she knocked on the door and waited for her friend to open it. "Oh, I'm glad you're here, Josie." "You are?" Josie was excited to hear it. "What can I help you with?" "I'm making a soup for supper, and I can't get the seasoning quite right." "Can you help me?" Josie was let down by the question, but as always, she was thrilled to help. She tasted the broth and added a few spices, then tasted it again. "I think we have it now." Elizabeth took a clean spoon and tasted it, and she smiled. "That's exactly right." "Thank you." "You're very welcome." Josie sat down at the table and looked around the house. It was spotless as she would expect from her friend. "So what have you been doing while I've been helping Miss Lillian?" "I've been going out of my mind. I didn't realize just how much I looked forward to your afternoon visits until they stopped." "Well, then maybe it's a good thing I took a break from coming over. Now we'll both appreciate the other more." Josie frowned. "Any news of Catherine and Nettie?" "Catherine's getting better. She's still weak, but she can now keep things in her stomach. Nettie is still helping her recover." "I see," Josie said. "Have you gotten to know any of the ladies in town?" Elizabeth shook her head. "Not really. I'm still spinning my wheels a bit as I try to learn how to keep this house." "And your marriage?" Elizabeth didn't meet Josie's eyes as she said. "Oh, it's fine." Josie sighed. Obviously, that was still something that Elizabeth wasn't going to talk to her about. "I'm going to start going to Miss Lillian's on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I can keep her house clean with 2 days per week and make sure she gets enough to eat. I'll probably deliver food most nights. I worry about how thin she is." "Did Ernie ever tell you what's wrong with her?" "Does he know?" Nothing, Josie said with a smile. When her children moved off the island, she quit leaving her house. She imagined a lot of things were wrong with her. I think she doesn't care to do anything with no one there to benefit from it other than herself. I can see that. Elizabeth frowned. I would think that being her age would mean that life was getting easier, but it sounds like hers has just gotten harder. She simply lost the will to take care of herself, it seems. I will continue to help her because I like her, and it gives me something to do. That's kind of you, Josie. I also sent my father a letter today. I want him to know where I am and that I'm all right. I doubt if Mrs. Melton will let him respond to me, but I at least wanted him to know. Does that make any sense? Elizabeth nodded. It makes a lot of sense to me. You and your father lived alone together for 5 years, and you did everything for him. I'm sure you were very close. I'm not sure I'd call us close. But we weren't strangers, and that's how it felt that last week I was in his home. I felt like I'd never known the man, and that isn't right. I still miss my mother, and I know he still missed her, too. She was the kind of person that was the glue in our family, and once she died, we both sort of fell apart. Josie hadn't talked about her mother's death in a very long time. Not like that, but it felt so good to say the words. It sounds like you loved her a great deal. It was impossible not to love my mother. As she cleaned, she would sing and dance about the room. I caught her dancing with mops and brooms and feather dusters more times than I can count. I always loved to see how joyful she was. Josie smiled as she thought about her. How did she die? Elizabeth asked. I still don't know. One day she was talking about pains in her side, and then next day she was dead. How sad. It really was. If I'd had a little time to get used to her dying, it may have been easier, but I'm not sure. As it was, I'm not sure I'll ever be the same. It sounds to me like you're just like her. You have that happy, conquer-the-world attitude that it sounds like she had. Josie nodded. But do you want to know what the difference is? Elizabeth nodded, frowning at the question. My mother came by it naturally, and I've worked very hard to force myself to have that attitude. I've just learned in the past few weeks to look at the positive in everything. I so want to be like her. I don't think you need to keep trying. I think you're already there. Chapter 10. Ernie was on time for supper that night, and Josie was pleased. She had convinced herself that he would always be late and never send word that he was going to be late. She took it as a win that he was on time, and she served supper warm for a change. As they ate, he watched her, as if he was trying to figure out if she was angry with him still. I'm fine, she finally said. I sent a letter to my father today to let him know I'm all right and how to reach me if he wants to. I think that's good. You need to make peace with him so you can feel at peace with yourself. Did you talk to him about all the hours he had you working? She shook her head. No, I didn't. I didn't see a need because I chose to do all I did. He would have hired someone if I'd asked, but it made me happy to do it. That makes sense. I think so. She looked down at her food, taking another bite. I hope to hear from him, but if I don't, I know I've done all I could to mend the fences between us. He reached over and took her hand, squeezing it. I'm glad you did it. Me too. After her anger the night before, it was harder to talk to him. She knew that she needed to apologize for her behavior, but she didn't want to. He'd apologized for what he'd done wrong, and if she apologized as well, would that just make it so he felt like what he'd done was all right? I'm sorry for getting so angry with you last night. You had every right to be that angry with me. I shouldn't have accused you of doing something wrong when you were just doing the same thing I did. But in a much kinder way. So you accept my apology? I accept it even though I don't think you should have given it. He brought her hand to his lips. Together, we're going to work through things like this. I'm going to get better at coming home on time, and maybe you could get better at telling me how you feel before you feel the need to explode. She grinned. That might be something for me to work on. Are you going to walk with me after the dishes are done? He asked softly. I don't feel like I'm really married unless we walk in the cool spring air. That sounds lovely. I like to walk with you. Can we go north tonight? She asked. North? Why do you want to go north? Because we've never gone that direction before, so tonight, we should. He laughed softly. My wife. Always logical. Oh, rarely logical, but always looking for ways to enjoy herself. I know I will enjoy walking a different direction than we usually do. She got up and started clearing the table, determined to get the dishes done as quickly as she could. She needed to spend time with him, and the faster the dishes were done, the longer they would have together. They walked out of town along the road to the north, and she enjoyed looking at everything around her. She saw a fox off to the right side of the road, and she stopped and pointed. Look. He stopped walking and looked over at the fox. Foxes don't usually attack humans. Sometimes they'll attack a cat, but they do sometimes carry rabies, so we have to be wary of them. Josie smiled. I just want to take him home with me and keep him forever. He's a wild animal. I don't think humans should keep wild animals. They are meant to be free. Ernie had seen many animals in captivity who seemed lost to him. It was something that really bothered him. Oh, I know. I just think he's cute, maybe a dog. He looked at her in surprise. Would you like a pet? I figured you wouldn't like the messes they make with as clean as you keep everything. She laughed softly. The thing you're forgetting is that I love to clean. A pet would cause me more work, and I would have something to do. He chuckled softly. You are different than anyone I've ever known. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Oh, definitely a good thing. There's no one else I'd rather kiss in the moonlight. She stepped toward him and wrapped her arms around him. Kisses make me happy. When Ernie arrived home from work the next evening, he had something in his arms. He knocked on the door, not quite able to open it, and when Josie opened it, she squealed with excitement. She reached out and took the 6-week-old puppy from Ernie's arms and held him close. Please tell me we're not watching him for a friend. Ernie laughed. Of course not. He's all yours. I can't believe you brought me a puppy. I've always wanted one. She ignored the fact that supper was ready and sank down to the floor with the puppy in her arms. What's your name? That's up to you to decide. Ernie sat down at the table and watched her with the puppy. He licked her face excitedly, and she giggled in response. Is it a boy or girl? It's a boy. He's an Irish setter. I'm not sure I can name him tonight. His name has to be absolutely perfect. Well, then you'd better start thinking about what to call him. Ernie was thrilled that she was so excited about his gift. I also thought if he was here, you'd be a little less lonely when I'm gone all day. I certainly will be. Josie got to her feet and threw herself at Ernie. Thank you so much. I love him almost as much as I love you. Ernie froze. Wait. You love me? Do you really think I would have put up with you otherwise? She asked with a grin. He laughed. You may have a point. I love you, too, Josie. So much. I hate that I've upset you, and I wanted to give you something special to make you feel better. She smiled, pressing her lips to his. Well, I think we're fine now. I have a puppy. Ernie grinned at her. So the puppy is the most important thing in your world now, right? No, that will always be you, Ernie. She looked down at the beautiful puppy in her arms and thought how sweet her husband was to bring her something she'd wanted so much. He was good to her. Epilogue. Toward the end of May, Josie received a letter from her father. She had given up on him writing back, and she sat down at the table with Lester playing at her feet. She carefully opened the letter, almost afraid of what the response would be. My dear Josie, I'm sorry it's taken me so long to write you back. I just found your letter shoved behind some books, obviously meant to be hidden from me. I hope you will forgive me for the unceremonious way my new wife kicked you out of your home. I hope you know that I didn't realize she was going to tell you in the manner she did. I had no idea just how much you did for me until she started trying to fill your shoes. You did more work than any 3 women should have done, and I must say, you did it all better than 3 women. I know because I now have 3 women trying to do your jobs half as well as you always did. Thank you for letting me know that you're safe. I miss you every day. Love, Father. Josie read the letter once more, tears falling down her face. He did appreciate her, and he missed her as well. She had no doubt that Mrs. Melton had hidden the letter from him, but she didn't care. He'd found it, and that's what really mattered. Ernie had been right to have her write to him. It had been the exact right decision for her, and she would tell him as soon as he arrived home. Life with Ernie was always hectic, but she loved him more than she could express, especially when he came home to supper on Tim,